Welcome to Let's Sleep Scary Stories. Today, I take you on a journey into the shadowed corners of Thailand that tourist brochures never mention. I am your narrator, and these stories are drawn from compelling accounts shared within online communities. Thailand, known for its stunning beaches, ancient temples, and vibrant culture, holds dark secrets beneath its tourist-friendly veneer. While millions of visitors and residents experience nothing but warmth and hospitality, a significant number encounter situations that challenge their safety and sometimes threaten their very survival. From serial killers operating with impunity on isolated islands to supernatural phenomena that defy explanation. From insurgent activities in the deep south to territorial street dogs in abandoned urban spaces. Thailand's dangers are as diverse as they are real. The following collection of accounts documents various encounters that illuminate these hidden risks. These stories serve not to discourage travel to Thailand, but to promote awareness and caution in a country where law enforcement can be inconsistent, where remote areas can quickly become threatening, and where the line between the natural and supernatural often blurs. Each narrative offers insight into surviving situations that tourist guidebooks rarely mention, providing valuable lessons for those who venture beyond the well-traveled paths of this fascinating but sometimes perilous kingdom. Our first story takes us to Brothel 35 in Kanchanaburi, where an urban explorer's routine photography session unveiled something that would follow him home. Story 1. The Haunting of Brothel 35 and the Price of Curiosity. Photography started as a way to escape my mundane office job. What began with smartphone shots of Bangkok street food evolved into a passion for urban exploration photography. My Instagram following grew steadily as I documented abandoned places around Thailand, forgotten temples, closed hotels, and places where history had left its mark. I spent my weekends exploring these locations, learning the technical aspects of photography through trial and error. The online urban exploration community became my second family, sharing tips about interesting locations and safety protocols. We had an unwritten rule: document, don't disturb. Take only photographs, leave only footprints. That's how I first heard about Brothel 35. A fellow explorer mentioned it in a private message. A 4-story concrete building on the outskirts of Kanchanaburi, with a history so dark that local taxi drivers refused to approach it after sunset. The message included a warning. Some places have a way of following you home. I spent weeks researching before my visit. The building's history unfolded like a horror novel. Constructed in the 1970s as a massage parlor, it became a hub of human trafficking throughout the 1980s. Police reports from 1991 detailed a raid that uncovered evidence of systematic exploitation. Hidden rooms, medical equipment for illegal procedures, and ledgers filled with names of missing women. But it was the basement that held the darkest secrets. 17 bodies were found in the foundation, though witnesses suggested many more remained undiscovered. The case files mention political protection and organized crime connections, but crucial documents disappeared, and key witnesses either recanted their testimonies or vanished entirely. My visit was planned meticulously. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, when the tourist crowds at nearby attractions would be thinnest. The humid air made my second-hand Canon fog up immediately, but otherwise, everything seemed normal, almost disappointing in its ordinariness. The first 2 floors yielded typical urbex shots: peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, graffiti from previous visitors. I documented everything methodically, taking both wide shots and close-ups of interesting details. The basement made me uneasy, but I attributed it to knowing the building's history. I took several ambient shots of the corridors and rooms, not paying particular attention to what was in the frame. Throughout the shoot, I had a nagging sensation of being watched, but that's common in abandoned buildings. The only unusual occurrence was a sudden battery drain in my camera, which I blamed on the humidity. I finished the shoot in about 3 hours, feeling slightly disappointed that such an infamous location had proved so unremarkable. That night, as I transferred the photos to my laptop, everything changed. In the first batch of photos, nothing seemed unusual. Standard urbex shots, documentation of decay, architectural details, remnants of the building's dark past. But as I reached the series taken in the basement, something caught my eye in one of the corridor shots. Between two door frames, partially obscured by shadow, stood what appeared to be a woman in a white dress. Initially, I rationalized it. Light plays tricks in abandoned buildings. Dust particles, reflections, maybe even a piece of hanging fabric could create such an illusion. After all, I'd been doing urban photography long enough to recognize common anomalies, but something about this image felt different. I opened Lightroom and began adjusting the contrast. With each enhancement, more details emerged. The figure wasn't just a silhouette. It had distinct features. Hollow eyes stared directly into my lens, and the expression, I'll never forget that expression. It carried centuries of sorrow mixed with something else. Accusation, as if I had intruded upon a private moment of grief. That's when I noticed something else. In the metadata, the photo was timestamped 3:33 a.m., but I had left the building well before noon. I began obsessively examining every photo from that day. In the background of various shots, barely noticeable at first, were other anomalies. A hand reaching through a doorway, a face reflected in a broken mirror, dark shapes moving between rooms. Each discovery led to another, like following breadcrumbs down an increasingly disturbing path. The most unsettling discovery came 3 days later. I was comparing my photos with historical documents about the brothel when I noticed something impossible. The woman in the white dress. Her face matched a photograph from a 1989 missing persons report. The article detailed the disappearance of a young woman named Malai, who was last seen entering brothel 35. Her body was never found. That's when the disturbances began in my condo. Subtle at first, items slightly out of place, the metallic taste in the air, the sound of footsteps when I was alone. My sleep became fragmented, interrupted by dreams of endless corridors and whispered conversations in Thai. Then the power surges started. My electronics would turn on randomly in the middle of the night. The television would switch to static, and through the white noise, I could sometimes hear what sounded like women crying. My phone would ring with no caller ID, playing only the sound of distant medical equipment and muffled screams. Last week, while reviewing the photos for the 100th time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the background of each photo where the woman in white appeared, there were numbers scratched into the walls. When arranged chronologically according to the metadata, they formed a sequence, coordinates. They led to a small temple on the outskirts of Kanchanaburi. The temple itself had been abandoned for decades, but local records showed it had connections to brothel 35. In the 1980s, several monks were excommunicated for performing unauthorized rituals there. The official documents were vague, but they mentioned ceremonies of binding and transactions of flesh and spirit. I knew I shouldn't go. Everything in my rational mind screamed against it. But by then, sleep deprivation and obsession had eroded my judgment. I arrived at the temple just before sunset. The interior was a single room, its walls covered in faded murals depicting what appeared to be religious ceremonies. But as I looked closer, the imagery became more disturbing. The ceremonies showed women being offered to something that lurked just outside the frame of each painting. In the center of the room stood an altar. On it lay a familiar white dress, perfectly preserved despite decades of abandonment. When I approached it, my camera turned on by itself and began rapidly taking photos. Later, reviewing these images would reveal something that shattered my understanding of reality. Each photo showed the room at a different point in time. Women in various states of distress, men in expensive suits performing rituals, and always in the background, the woman in white, watching, waiting. The final photo showed my own face among the victims. Since then, my grip on reality has become increasingly tenuous. The woman in white appears more frequently now, not just in photographs, but in reflections, in the corner of my eye, standing at the foot of my bed at night. She's trying to tell me something, show me something, but I fear understanding would cost me my sanity. The worst part? I've started noticing features in my face changing subtly in mirrors and photographs. My eyes are becoming hollow, my expression carrying that same mixture of sorrow and accusation. And sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I find myself wearing a white dress I don't own. I'm sharing this as a warning. Urban exploration has rules for a reason. Some places aren't abandoned, they're waiting. Some stories aren't meant to be documented, and some photographs capture more than just light and shadow. Yesterday, I discovered all my photos from Brothel 35 have vanished from my hard drive. In their place is a single image, a group photo of 17 women in white dresses. I recognize them all from the missing persons reports. I'm in the photograph too, standing at the end of the line. The metadata shows this photo will be taken next week. Story 2, A Voice in the Night. My first visit to Nakhon Sawan was meant to be a simple meeting with my future in-laws. Sarah, my then fiancée, had warned me about her family's ancestral home, a sprawling teak structure that had stood for over a century. But it wasn't the house's imposing architecture that concerned her. "There's something you need to know," she had said during our flight from Bangkok. "Everyone who stays in that house hears voices at night. They'll call your name. Whatever you do, don't answer." I remembered smiling, attributing her warning to traditional Thai superstitions. After all, I was a pragmatic software engineer from Seattle. Ghost stories were entertaining, but hardly something to take seriously. The house sat on elevated stilts, typical of traditional Thai architecture, with intricate woodwork that spoke of bygone craftsmanship. Sarah's grandmother, a dignified woman in her 80s, greeted us with traditional Thai hospitality, though I noticed how her eyes lingered on me with an unspoken concern. That evening, after a generous dinner of local specialties, Sarah's grandmother pulled me aside. In halting English, she repeated the warning. "You will hear voices. They know your name now. Do not answer." Before I could ask for clarification, she retreated to her quarters, leaving me with more questions than answers. Our bedroom was on the second floor, where the wooden floors creaked with every step. The humidity made the air heavy, but the ceiling fan provided enough comfort for sleep. Sarah drifted off quickly, her breathing becoming slow and regular beside me. I lay awake for a while, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of tropical nights. Cicadas, distant dogs, the gentle rustling of leaves in the mango trees outside. Eventually, fatigue from the long journey overcame my curiosity about the house's reputation, and I fell into a deep sleep. James. The voice cut through my dreams like a knife. It was Sarah's voice, clear and distinct, calling my name from somewhere in the darkness. James. I instinctively turned towards Sarah's sleeping form beside me. Her chest rose and fell with the deep breaths of uninterrupted sleep. A chill ran down my spine as I heard it again. James. The voice was unmistakably hers, the same gentle lilt she used when calling me from another room. But Sarah was clearly asleep beside me, and this voice came from the darkness of the hallway. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. The wooden floorboards outside our room creaked, as if someone was shifting their weight just beyond the door. The sound of bare feet on teak, deliberate and unhurried. James, please. The voice had changed subtly. There was something underneath Sarah's familiar tones. A different voice, older perhaps, speaking in unison with hers. The ceiling fan cast rotating shadows across the room, and in those brief moments of darkness, I could have sworn I saw movement in the corner. I found myself opening my mouth to respond, the word yes forming on my lips. Sarah's grandmother's warning echoed in my mind just in time. I pressed my lips together, focusing on Sarah's sleeping form beside me, anchoring myself to reality. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. My own voice, coming from the hallway, answering, "What is it?" But I hadn't spoken. The creaking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the night insects had gone quiet. Then came the sound of multiple feet, running toward our door. Not the sound of one person, but many, their footsteps overlapping in a chaotic percussion. I reached for Sarah, but my hand passed through empty air. The bed beside me was empty and cold, as if no one had slept there at all. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to turn on the bedside lamp. The light flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the walls. In that stuttering illumination, I saw Sarah lying beside me again, still peacefully asleep. My racing heart began to slow, but only for a moment, because in the mirror across the room, Sarah's reflection was sitting upright, staring directly at me. I watched, paralyzed, as the reflection turned its head at an impossible angle. Its mouth opened, stretching wider than humanly possible, and that doubled voice emerged again. "Why didn't you answer me, James?" The room's temperature plummeted. The ceiling fan slowed to a stop, despite still being switched on. In the sudden stillness, I could hear whispers in Thai coming from all directions, growing increasingly urgent. Sarah's grandmother had once mentioned that this house had served as a shelter during World War II. Hundreds had sought refuge here, she'd said, but she never spoke about what happened to them. Later, I would learn that the Japanese army had discovered the hideout. The soldiers had called out each person's name, one by one, before. I felt something cold touch my shoulder. In the mirror, I could see a hand there, but when I turned to look, nothing was visible. The whispers grew louder, and I began to distinguish individual voices, dozens of them, each calling different names, creating a horrifying cacophony. Sarah stirred beside me, her eyes opening slowly. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. But her reflection in the mirror remained upright, its head still twisted unnaturally, mouth still stretched in that impossible grin. And now it was reaching toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. "You should have answered," the reflection said, its voice now a chorus of countless others. "Now you'll have to listen to all of us." That was 6 months ago. We left the house the next morning, but something followed us home. Every night, I hear voices calling my name. Not not just Sarah's voice now, but hundreds of others. And sometimes, when I look in mirrors, I see them standing behind me, their mouths moving in unison, waiting for me to answer. Sarah says I talk in my sleep now, carrying on conversations with people who aren't there. But the worst part? Sometimes, when she calls my name during the day, I'm afraid to answer, because I can never be sure if it's really her voice I'm hearing. Story 3. The Price of Paradise. After 30 years in investment banking, Richard had achieved what many would consider the dream. Early retirement at 52 with enough wealth to live comfortably anywhere in the world. He chose Pattaya, Thailand's famous resort city, drawn by its pristine beaches and promises of an eternal summer. I learned Richard's story through mutual connections in the expatriate community. Like many Western men who settle in Pattaya, he found himself enchanted by the city's notorious nightlife. That's where he met Nan, a 23-year-old bar girl from Udon Thani city in the province of Isan. What began as a typical tourist bar girl encounter evolved into something more. Richard saw potential in Nan that others had missed. She was taking English classes, she said, planning for a future beyond the bars. He believed he could give her a chance at a better life. Their courtship followed a familiar pattern: expensive gifts, promises of security, and finally, a shared luxury condominium on Pattaya Beach Road. Richard's friends described him as rejuvenated, like a man half his age. Nan moved in, and for a while, it seemed like both had found what they were looking for. The changes were subtle at first. Richard's weekly calls with his daughter in London became monthly, then quarterly. His regular golf games with other expatriates dwindled. He stopped going to bars and also stopped attending the monthly meetups at the British Club. When friends called, Nan would often answer, saying Richard was sleeping or unwell. His daughter tried to visit twice. The first time, Richard cancelled at the last minute, citing a minor illness. The second time, Nan told her at the condo lobby that Richard didn't want to see her. Richard's daughter said his emails became increasingly distant, filled with excuses about why he couldn't talk on the phone. Then came the financial transactions. Small at first, investments in a small business, loans for family emergencies. Later, larger sums for land purchases in Isan, Nan's home region. Richard's financial advisor raised concerns about the rapid depletion of his retirement funds, but Richard dismissed them. The last person to see Richard alive was his neighbour, an Australian retiree. He reported seeing Richard on their shared balcony at 3 a.m, staring out at the dark waters of the Gulf of Thailand. Richard looked gaunt, aged beyond his years. When the Australian tried to speak with him, Richard merely shook his head and went inside. The following morning, security footage showed Richard entering the elevator at 4:17 a.m. He rode to the 21st floor, not his floor, and proceeded to the emergency stairwell. At 4:23 a.m., several cameras captured his fall. The police investigation revealed troubling details. Richard's bank accounts had been systematically drained over the previous 18 months. Property documents showed that substantial investments had been made in Nan's name. Land purchases, construction projects, and business ventures, all in Isan. The luxury condo they shared was also in her name. 2 days before his death, Richard had attempted to contact his financial advisor. The call logs showed 5 missed attempts. His email drafts folder contained an unfinished message to his daughter. "I've made a terrible mistake. Everything is gone. I don't know who." Nan was questioned briefly by the police, but provided documentation showing she had been visiting family in Udon Thani at the time of Richard's death. The investigation concluded with a ruling of suicide. The case was closed within a week. 3 months after Richard's death, photos began appearing on social media. Nan, smiling in front of a newly constructed mansion in Isan. Nan, posing with a new Mercedes. Nan, celebrating with family at what appeared to be a housewarming party. The geotags placed her in Udon Thani, far from the towering condominiums of Pattaya. Richard's daughter tried to pursue legal action, but the property transfers had been conducted legally. All documents bore Richard's authenticated signatures. The Thai police showed little interest in reopening the case. The Australian neighbour later shared something that hadn't made it into the official report. The night before Richard's death, he had heard an argument through the walls. A woman's voice, speaking rapidly in Thai. A man's voice, Richard's, repeating pleas over and over. Then silence. Richard's story has become a cautionary tale in Pattaya's expatriate community. But perhaps the most chilling aspect isn't the money, the manipulation, or even the tragic end. It's the calculated precision of it all. The gradual isolation, the systematic transfer of assets, the perfectly timed absence during his final moments. In the end, Richard became another statistic in Thailand's expatriate suicide records and a member of Pattaya's flying club. His body was cremated at a local temple, attended only by a handful of embassy staff. No family members were present. Nan's social media accounts continued to document her rising prosperity in Isan, each post a silent testament to a paradise lost. Story 4. A wrong turn at dusk. One day, my partner and I were out doing a day-long walk to explore unknown areas. I've wandered countless sois and alleyways, but what my partner and I encountered during one evening walk in 2023 still haunts me, defying all rational explanation. The day began innocently enough. We'd spent hours exploring the riverfront around Asiatique, capturing the contrast between modern development and old Bangkok. As the afternoon waned, we decided to take what appeared to be a shortcut through the back Sawas toward Sharon Krung Road. The transition was gradual but unmistakable. With each turn, the streets grew narrower, the buildings older, the atmosphere heavier. Modern Bangkok seemed to peel away like old wallpaper, revealing something far older underneath. Street vendors began closing their stalls, metal shutters coming down with hollow clangs that echoed through the increasingly narrow passages. The light changed too. Dusk in Bangkok usually brings a cascade of neon, but here, darkness gathered in corners and doorways like something tangible. The few streetlights cast more shadows than illumination, creating pools of murky yellow light that seemed to stop abruptly, as if absorbed by the surrounding darkness. We had been walking for nearly an hour when we came upon the house. Even now, months later, I struggle to describe what made it so profoundly unsettling. It stood between two industrial buildings, its wooden facade weathered to the color of old bones. Religious amulets and talismans covered every available surface of the doorframe. Not the usual Buddhist imagery one expects in Bangkok, but something older, more primal. The metal gate stood wide open, as if in invitation. Beyond it, a corridor stretched into absolute darkness. Not the ordinary darkness of an unlit hallway, but something that seemed to swallow light entirely. To the right of the corridor, a small room was visible, its wooden walls similarly festooned with religious symbols. But it was the darkness of that corridor that held my attention, seeming to pulse with a life of its own. As we stood there, transfixed, something seemed to shift in that impenetrable darkness. The religious symbols, which I later learned were a mix of ancient animist and Hindu motifs predating Buddhism's arrival in Thailand, appeared to vibrate slightly, though there was no wind in the narrow sawai. A faint sound emerged from the corridor, like whispered prayers in a language I couldn't identify. My partner tugged at my sleeve, urging me to move on, but for a moment, I found myself unable to look away from that doorway. In the corner of my eye, I noticed movement in the small room. Shadows shifting against shadows, forming shapes that seemed almost human, but not quite. What happened next remains difficult to explain. As we finally managed to turn away and continue down the street, or, as Thai people refer to it, soy, the streetlights behind us began to flicker and die, one by one, as if something was following our progress. The darkness seemed to pursue us, pushing us forward into the increasingly sparse illumination ahead. That's when we encountered him, the man my partner would later describe as moving like a zombie. He appeared suddenly, emerging from between two buildings. His movements were wrong in a way that defied description. His head and upper body tilted at an impossible angle, as if his spine had been partially dislocated. He would walk a few steps, pause, and then rotate his entire body to look around, movements jerky and unnatural. But it was his pattern of movement that truly disturbed me. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was making precise circles around specific houses, always the same ones, like a ritual being performed. When he paused, his head would snap towards certain doorways, as if listening for something we couldn't hear. We pressed ourselves against a wall, trying to become invisible in the growing darkness. As we watched, he completed another circuit and approached the house with the dark corridor. For a moment, he stood perfectly still before the open gate. Then, slowly, methodically, he began to turn his head toward us. We didn't stay to see more. We ran the remaining distance to Sharon Krung Road, not stopping until we reached the familiar comfort of street vendors and traffic. Later that night, I tried to locate the street on Google Maps, wanting to understand what we had seen, but the satellite view showed only a solid block of buildings where that narrow street should have been. I've returned to that area several times since then, in daylight, trying to retrace our steps. I've never found that street again, nor the house with its consuming darkness. But sometimes, when I'm walking through Bangkok at dusk, I catch glimpses of similar religious symbols out of the corner of my eye, and I wonder about what lies behind the modern facade of this ancient city, and what rituals are still being performed in its forgotten corners. I consulted with a local historian about the area we had wandered into. She explained that before modern Bangkok was built, that region had been home to ancient animist temples. The practices there predated organized religion, focusing on appeasing spirits that were neither good nor evil, but operated on their own incomprehensible logic. The historian mentioned something else that chilled me. Every few years, people would report similar experiences in that area. Encounters with a man performing ritualistic movements, houses that couldn't be found again, and religious symbols that seemed to watch those who passed by. Story 5. The Roadside Encounter. My experience on the outskirts of Chiang Mai's old city defies rational explanation, though I've spent 5 years trying to understand what happened that evening. I was a visiting professor at Chiang Mai University then, teaching a semester of comparative literature. What I encountered that October evening would fundamentally change my understanding of reality. The incident occurred as I was attempting to navigate my way to the night markets. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty street. The ancient walls of the old city loomed in the distance, their weathered stones holding centuries of history. In retrospect, I should have noticed how unusually deserted the street was for that time of day. The first indication that something was amiss came when I observed what I initially assumed to be a person crossing the road ahead. However, the movement was wrong. Not the fluid motion of human locomotion, but rather a jerky, almost insectoid scuttling. The figure emerged from what appeared to be an abandoned building, its form seeming to shift and change as it moved, as if its anatomy couldn't quite decide on a final configuration. In the fading light, I could discern enough details to know that whatever I was seeing wasn't human, though my mind desperately tried to categorize it as such. Its proportions were inconsistent, limbs too long and bent at impossible angles. It moved with a purpose, heading toward a cluster of traditional wooden houses. As I approached the spot where the entity had crossed, something extraordinary occurred. The air around my motorcycle suddenly filled with what I can only describe as a luminescent mist. The particles sparkled with an otherworldly iridescence, like diamond dust suspended in twilight. But this beautiful display quickly turned sinister. The moment I inhaled this substance, my lungs seized. The coughing fit that followed was so severe I had to pull over. The mist seemed to have a consciousness of its own, swirling around me in patterns that couldn't have been caused by natural air currents. As I struggled to breathe, I noticed the temperature had dropped dramatically, despite the typical Thai evening warmth. That was just the beginning. The symptoms manifested within hours. What began as severe coughing evolved into something the doctors at Maharaj Nakhon Chiang Mai Hospital couldn't diagnose. My lungs showed unusual patterns on X-rays, patterns that one physician said resembled ancient Lana symbols, though he quickly dismissed this observation. For 3 months, I experienced respiratory symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding. The coughing would intensify at sunset, and during particularly severe episodes, witnesses reported seeing a faint shimmer in the air around me, similar to the mist I'd encountered that evening. During my hospital stays, I began researching the area where the incident occurred. The abandoned building, I discovered, had once been a spirit house for a now-defunct temple. Local elders spoke of ancient practices involving guardian entities that protected sacred boundaries. These entities, they claimed, weren't ghosts in the traditional sense, but something older, beings that existed in the space between the physical and spiritual realms. One elderly monk at Wat Chedi Luang provided particularly disturbing information. He explained that in ancient Lana tradition, there were beings known as Phi Phai, entities that could take physical form, but preferred to exist as a type of luminescent mist. These beings were said to guard forgotten sacred spaces, and encounters with them often resulted in a prolonged illness that traditional medicine couldn't cure. The monk mentioned something else that chilled me. My symptoms aligned perfectly with historical accounts of Phi Phai encounters. The 3-month duration was consistent, as was the pattern of symptoms intensifying at sunset. In traditional Lana medicine, such afflictions were seen not as bacterial or viral infections, but as a gradual transformation, the entity's attempt to mark or claim its victim. The illness ended as suddenly as it began, exactly 3 months after the encounter, but its effects lingered in other ways. I began noticing strange phenomena in photographs taken of me during that period. Distortions in the air around my figure, similar to heat waves but forming distinct patterns. More disturbing were the dreams, vivid visions of that misshapen figure, now recognizable as something that had never been human, performing elaborate rituals in ancient temple ruins. Today, 5 years later, I still can't pass that street without experiencing a tightness in my chest. The abandoned building was demolished last year to make way for new construction, but workers reported unusual accidents and equipment failures throughout the project. Several claimed to have seen a luminescent mist rising from the foundation at sunset, and 3 developed respiratory problems that lasted exactly 3 months. I've come to accept that some aspects of Thailand's ancient spiritual landscape refuse to yield to modern understanding. Whatever I encountered that evening exists in a realm beyond our conventional categories of real and unreal. The only certainty is that it marked me in ways I'm still discovering. And somewhere in Chiang Mai's gathering dusk, it continues its ancient vigil. Story 6, Echoes of Faith. There's something deeply personal about hearing ghost stories from one's grandmother. My summers in Thailand during the 1990s were filled with such moments, huddled around an old radio, listening to tales that blended seamlessly with our family's own supernatural encounters. But it wasn't until years later, during my brief time as a monk in Chiang Mai, that I truly understood the profound connection between Thai spirituality and these unexplained phenomena. Let me start with my uncle's story at what is now Icon Siam. In the early 1980s, that area was a maze of klongs, canals, lined with wooden houses on stilts and floating markets. The river spirits were particularly active there, according to local beliefs. One scorching afternoon, my uncle was swimming in a klong, as teenagers often did before development claimed these waterways. He described feeling something grab his ankle, not like a plant or debris, but with deliberate force. The grip was cold and strong, pulling him downward with increasing strength. He managed to break free only after reciting a prayer his mother had taught him. When he surfaced, gasping, the water around him was completely still, despite the violent struggle moments before. My aunt's experience occurred near Siriraj Hospital, in one of those old wooden houses that still stand in the hospital's shadow. In Thai culture, sleeping with your head pointing toward a door is considered dangerous. It's believed to create a pathway for spirits to pull your soul from your body. One night, despite knowing this, my aunt found herself in exactly such a position at her relative's house. She awoke to a sensation of being slowly drawn out of herself, as if her essence was being extracted through her head. She described seeing her own body below her as she was pulled upward, fighting against an invisible force that seemed determined to separate her spirit from her physical form. These family stories stayed with me when I made the decision to ordain as a monk in Chiang Mai during the early days of COVID-19. My father, who had also taken robes, advised me about the different types of encounters I might experience during meditation. The deeper you go, he said, the thinner the veil becomes between our world and others. I still remember the exact moment it happened. I was in deep meditation within the temple grounds, the kind of stillness where the boundary between self and surroundings begins to blur. That's when I saw him, half a man, dragging himself across the temple floor toward me. His torso ended abruptly at the waist, and his face carried an expression of desperate pleading. He reached out, mouthing words I couldn't hear. My inexperience showed in that moment. Instead of maintaining my meditation and acknowledging his presence, as the senior monks later told me I should have done, I snapped back to ordinary consciousness. The apparition vanished, but the heaviness in the air remained. Later that day, I learned about the motorcycle accident victim. He had been cut in half by a truck on the road adjacent to the temple. His family came daily to make merit and leave offerings at precisely the spot where I had seen his spirit. The senior monks explained that such appearances were common. Souls in transition often sought out temples and those in meditation, hoping to find peace or convey final messages. Other monks shared similar experiences with me. One described encountering the spirit of a young woman who had died during childbirth, still cradling an invisible infant. Another spoke of seeing an elderly man who would appear during morning alms rounds, trying to offer food to the monks despite no longer being physically present. These experiences weren't limited to the temple grounds. The entire city of Chiang Mai seemed to exist in two realms simultaneously: the physical world of markets, traffic, and tourists, and an older dimension where spirits moved freely among the living. The ancient walls of the old city weren't just historical artifacts. They marked boundaries between these worlds. My father, with his longer experience in the monkhood, explained that what we Westerners call ghost stories are actually glimpses into this parallel reality that Thai culture has always acknowledged. The radio stories I listened to with my grandmother weren't merely entertainment. They were part of a cultural framework for understanding these intersections between worlds. These experiences fundamentally changed my understanding of Thai spirituality. It wasn't just about beliefs or traditions. It was about accepting that reality is far more complex than our modern, rational minds want to admit. The spirits of the Klongs, the soul-stealing entities near hospitals, the half-man in the temple, they were all part of a continuous spectrum of existence that Thai culture has never forgotten. Story 7. A Midnight Visitor. In the jungle-covered hills of Koh Phangan, there are stories that even the most skeptical visitors cannot explain away. Mine began during the low season of 2018, when I rented a secluded villa surrounded by dense tropical forest. The property was exactly what I sought: peaceful, remote, and far from the famous full moon party beaches. The first day passed uneventfully, filled with the sounds of cicadas and distant monkeys. The isolation felt therapeutic after months of working in Bangkok's corporate sector. That changed on my second night. At approximately 1 a.m., a knock at my door disrupted the jungle's nocturnal chorus. Opening it revealed a Caucasian man, perhaps in his 30s, wearing what appeared to be dated tourist attire. A white linen shirt and khaki pants that seemed oddly formal for the tropical setting. "Excuse me," he said, his accent unplaceable. "Would you mind sharing some water, Michael?" It wasn't until I was retrieving the water from my kitchen that the irregularity struck me. I hadn't introduced myself to anyone on the island, yet he knew my name. The realization sent a chill through me, despite the tropical heat. When I returned with the glass, he consumed the water with an urgency that seemed almost desperate. The water disappeared in seconds, as if he hadn't drunk anything for days. When I asked how he knew my name, he merely smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes, before turning and walking into the jungle. The next morning, I investigated the direction he had taken. What I found defied logic. The path he'd followed led to an impenetrable wall of vegetation, with no trails or clearings beyond. The jungle there was pristine, showing no signs of human passage. When I spoke with my host later that morning, her reaction intensified my unease. She confirmed that not only were there no other guests in the nearby villas, but the nearest occupied accommodation was over a kilometer away. Her warning to never answer the door at night carried the weight of local knowledge I hadn't yet understood. Disturbed by the encounter, I began researching the area's history. The property, I discovered, was built on land that once belonged to an old coconut plantation. In the 1970s, when Koh Phangan first became popular with Western travelers, several tourists had disappeared in this region. their cases remaining unsolved. One particular case from 1976 caught my attention. A British traveller named Peter had vanished during the dry season, last seen wearing clothing that matched my midnight visitor's attire. According to witness statements, he had become dehydrated while hiking in the area, and search parties found no trace despite weeks of effort. The locals I spoke with shared their own perspectives. An elderly woman who ran a nearby shop explained that in Thai belief, spirits of those who die of thirst often seek water from the living. But once they receive it, she added, they can finally move on. This aligned with what my friend later suggested, that the water may have set him free. The thought that I had inadvertently helped release a trapped spirit both unsettled and comforted me. The precision of his colonial-era clothing, his inexplicable knowledge of my name, and the impossible path he took into the jungle began to make a different kind of sense. In the remaining days of my stay, I never heard another knock at my door, though sometimes, in the early hours, I would wake to the sound of footsteps on my porch, fading into the jungle. The air would feel unusually cool, carrying a scent of old fabric and sea salt, though the ocean was miles away. Before I left the island, I visited the local temple to make merit, following the advice of my host. The monk there listened to my story without surprise. Water is life, he said simply. In giving it, you helped complete an unfinished journey. Years later, I still think about that encounter, about the mysterious visitor who knew my name and disappeared into impossible terrain. Sometimes, on particularly humid nights, my glasses of water seem to empty themselves when I'm not looking. I've learned to accept this as a reminder that in Thailand, the line between the physical and spiritual worlds is often as thin as the surface of water in a glass offered to a midnight visitor. Story 8. The Lady in Red. In Mae Hong Son's old quarter, where ancient Shan architecture meets modern Thai development, I operated a restaurant in a building with a complex history. The establishment had previously served as a karaoke bar, but its past extended far deeper into the region's darker history. The first incidents began with one of my employees, a young woman from Shan State. She reported recurring encounters with an apparition, a woman in a red dress who would appear at the second-floor window during afternoon rest periods. Initially, I attributed her accounts to homesickness and the natural anxiety of being far from her family. However, events escalated when she ran downstairs one afternoon in visible distress, trembling and describing an encounter with the same figure. The intensity of her reaction prompted me to take action. I decided to cover the window, selecting a large piece of cloth as a temporary solution. What occurred next defied rational explanation. While attempting to secure the cloth, I experienced something that fundamentally altered my understanding of reality. As I reached to nail the second corner, an unseen force grabbed my shoulder with significant force, pulling me backward. The room was empty, yet the physical sensation of fingers gripping my shoulder was undeniable. When I turned back toward the window, I encountered what I can only describe as an ambulatory mist. This ethereal formation moved with apparent purpose, advancing toward me before seemingly merging with my physical form through my chest cavity. The immediate physiological response was severe, an intense cold that penetrated to my core, accompanied by uncontrollable tremors that persisted for hours despite attempts to warm myself with alcohol and hot water. Later investigation revealed the building's dark history. A Burmese Lady of the Night had been murdered in that very room years before, though details of the crime remained shrouded in local silence. The revelation provided context for the persistent supernatural activity we had experienced. Following local custom, we arranged for Buddhist monks to perform a blessing ceremony. Their presence and ritual seemed to alter the room's energy, as subsequent paranormal incidents ceased entirely. However, one peculiar phenomenon persisted: a distinct cold spot in the room, approximately 50 by 30 centimeters in size. This cold spot became something of a controlled experiment. Without providing prior information, I would invite customers to walk through the room and note any atmospheric variations they detected. With remarkable consistency, individuals would identify the exact same location as having a distinctly different temperature and sensation from the surrounding area. The precision with which different people identified this specific spot was particularly noteworthy. The area remained consistently cold regardless of the ambient temperature or time of day, defying conventional explanations of air circulation or structural features. The cold spot's dimensions never varied, maintaining its precise boundaries as if demarcating a specific event or presence. What I found most compelling was the range of reactions from those who encountered this phenomenon. Skeptics and believers alike would stop at the exact same location, often exhibiting physical reactions such as shivering or goosebumps before being told about the spot's significance. Their consistent identification of this precise location, without prior knowledge, suggested something beyond mere suggestion or expectation. The experience fundamentally altered my perspective on the supernatural. The physical nature of my encounter, the grip on my shoulder, the penetrating cold, the persistent tremors, combined with the consistent experiences of others, created a compelling body of evidence that defied conventional explanation. It demonstrated how Thailand's spiritual realm can manifest in tangible, measurable ways, even to those initially skeptical of such possibilities. Story 9. The Medium of Outer Bangkok. In the suburbs of Bangkok, where modern housing developments meet ancient traditions, I encountered a manifestation of Thai spiritual practices that challenged my Western understanding of reality. The event occurred during a religious ceremony at my ex-partner's uncle's residence. Though ceremony inadequately describes what I witnessed. The setting was deliberately constructed. A simple tent erected in the center of the neighborhood, surrounded by local residents. Inside sat my ex's uncle, transformed from the jovial businessman I had previously met into something markedly different. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements altered, and he chain-smoked cigarettes with mechanical precision. The atmosphere around the tent carried a palpable weight. What I initially witnessed was a traditional Thai spirit medium session, though I didn't immediately recognize it as such. The uncle's voice had changed completely, speaking Thai in tones and cadences that seemed to belong to different individuals. I later learned that he was serving as a channel for the deceased, allowing community members to communicate with departed loved ones. The transformation in his demeanor was profound. His usual personality had been entirely subsumed, replaced by a succession of distinct entities. Each shift brought noticeable changes in his posture, speech patterns, and mannerisms. The local residents treated the phenomenon with a mixture of reverence and familiarity, suggesting this was a regular occurrence in their community. The participants approached him one by one, seeking connections with deceased relatives or answers to unresolved questions. The responses they received often contained information that, I was told, only the deceased could have known. The medium spoke of private conversations, shared secrets, and intimate details that left many participants visibly moved or shaken. What struck me most was the community's acceptance of this practice. In this outer district of Bangkok, where modern convenience stores stood alongside traditional spirit houses, The boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds seemed remarkably permeable. The event wasn't treated as supernatural or extraordinary, but rather as an essential community service, a bridge between the living and the dead. Story 10. The Thin Line. What began as a conventional relationship in Bangkok evolved into an unsettling exploration of the boundaries between mental health and supernatural phenomena. My experience with Nim, not her real name, challenged my understanding of both psychological disorders and Thai spiritual beliefs. During daylight hours, Nim was a successful professional working in Bangkok's financial district. She was articulate, intelligent, and thoroughly modern in her outlook. However, as darkness fell, profound changes would manifest in her personality and perception of reality. The transformations often occurred during our evening motorcycle rides through Bangkok streets. Without warning, her entire demeanor would shift. Her voice would drop an octave, her speech patterns would alter, and she would begin narrating encounters with entities that existed beyond my perception. These episodes became particularly pronounced whenever we encountered rats, a common sight in Bangkok's evening hours. The mere presence of a rodent would trigger an immediate and dramatic personality shift. What made these experiences particularly compelling was the precision with which she would describe these supernatural encounters. She would point to specific locations, describing entities with detailed characteristics, their clothing, their movements, their intentions. Sometimes, her observations aligned with actual people in our vicinity. Other times, she described presences in completely empty spaces. The clinical diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder provided one framework for understanding these experiences. However, in the context of Thai culture, where the intersection between mental health and spiritual sensitivity is viewed differently than in the West, her experiences suggested something more complex. Mental health professionals who worked with her noted that her episodes didn't fully conform to typical DID patterns. Her evil personality, as she termed it, seemed to emerge specifically in response to certain environmental triggers and during traditional spirit hours, between 2 and 3 a.m., a time many Thais associate with heightened supernatural activity. Story 11. The Last Ride. Late one night in Pattaya, I made a decision that nearly cost me everything. Having spent the evening at a beachfront restaurant, I opened my Bolt app to request a ride back to Bangkok. The streets were emptying, and an unseasonal cold wind swept in from the Gulf of Thailand. The man who approached me bore little resemblance to the driver profile on my app. His face was a canvas of crude tattoos. Metal gleamed from multiple facial piercings, and his eyes held something predatory. But what truly disturbed me was how he seemed to materialize from the shadows, as if the darkness itself had given him form. "I'm your driver," he announced, his voice carrying an edge that made my skin crawl. I showed him the app, pointing out the discrepancy between his appearance and the profile photo. His response chilled me. "Oh, I'm not taking you. My friend is." The way he said friend made me think of everything I'd heard about Pattaya's underground criminal networks, the disappearances, the ransoms, the bodies sometimes found in shallow graves outside the city. His entire demeanor suggested someone accustomed to violence, someone who operated in a world where rules and laws held no meaning. When I hesitated, his facade cracked. He demanded 1,200 baht as a cancellation fee, an amount that seemed arbitrary but significant. His threat about calling his friends carried implications that made my blood run cold. I could almost see them in my mind, figures emerging from the darkness, surrounding me, leading to an outcome I didn't want to contemplate. Standing there on that dimly lit street, I realized I was facing a critical decision. The wrong choice could lead me into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. Pattaya's dark underbelly was reaching out to claim another victim, and I was standing on its threshold. Behind him, I noticed movement in the shadows, figures shifting in the darkness, watching, waiting. My phone's signal had mysteriously disappeared, though it had been strong moments before. The street had emptied completely, the usual tourists and locals conspicuously absent. He moved closer, his tattoos seeming to writhe in the dim streetlight. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. Some of his tattoos appeared to be fresh, still seeping, and they weren't the usual designs you'd see in Pattaya's tattoo shops. They looked like crude symbols, reminiscent of the protective Sakyant tattoos, but distorted, wrong somehow. "Last chance," he said, pulling out a phone that looked nothing like what Bolt drivers typically use. "My friends are very close indeed." As he spoke, I heard car engines starting up in multiple directions and saw headlights flickering on in the darkness. In that moment, I recalled all the stories I'd heard about tourists in Pattaya, the ones who vanished without a trace, whose families received ransom demands that led nowhere, whose bodies were sometimes found months later in remote locations with strange marks carved into their skin. I made a split-second decision. There was a 24-hour family mart just steps away, its fluorescent lights promising safety and witnesses. I turned and ran, hearing him bark orders in Thai behind me. The sound of multiple footsteps followed, but I didn't look back. I crashed through the store's entrance, past startled customers, and straight to the counter where two staff members were watching a police drama on their phones. When I finally dared to look outside, the man was gone. But so were all the witnesses to what had happened. The store's other customers had vanished in the seconds it took me to catch my breath. The staff members seemed unnaturally interested in their phones, refusing to meet my eyes. Through the store's windows, I could see multiple cars with darkened windows slowly circling the block. I called a friend who lived nearby to pick me up, staying inside the store until he arrived. Later, when I tried to report the incident to Bolt, they had no record of my ride request from that night. The local police showed no interest in my story, though one officer did tell me, off the record, that there had been similar reports, all from that same stretch of road, all around the same time of night. I still think about what might have happened if I'd gotten into that car, if I'd followed his friend into the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, I see cars with darkened windows following me, and I catch glimpses of tattoos that seem to move in the streetlights. And occasionally, my phone will ring with no caller ID, playing only the sound of engines idling in the darkness. Story 12. The Mae Sot Trap. Mae Sot had seemed like the perfect destination for a digital nomad seeking an authentic Thai experience away from the tourist crowds. Situated on the Myanmar border, the city offered a fascinating blend of Thai and Burmese cultures, affordable living, and reliable internet. Everything I needed to run my freelance web development business. I rented a modern apartment in a quiet neighborhood, settling into a routine of work, local exploration, and occasional socializing. The relative isolation sometimes felt overwhelming, which is why I turned to dating apps. That's where I met Min, her profile showing a striking woman in her late 20s, educated in Singapore, who claimed to work remotely for a fintech company. Our first meeting at a local cafe went surprisingly well. Min was articulate, knowledgeable about cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, and seemed genuinely interested in my work. Over the next few weeks, we developed what I thought was a genuine connection, meeting regularly for dinner and exploring the city together. Looking back, I should have noticed the red flags. Min never invited me to her apartment, always preferring to meet in public places. She asked detailed questions about my income, work schedule, and family connections. When I mentioned having few close contacts in Thailand, her eyes lit up in a way that should have alarmed me. 1 month into our relationship, Min suggested a trip to Samnak Songpra That Doi Hin Kyu, a Buddhist temple near the Myanmar border. She described it as a spiritual place where locals went for blessing and good fortune. The temple's remote location didn't concern me. I trusted Min, and the idea of exploring off-the-beaten-path locations appealed to my sense of adventure. The day started normally enough. Min picked me up in what she said was her cousin's car, a black Toyota Fortuner with tinted windows. I noticed 2 men in the front seat, whom Min introduced as her cousin and his friend, both nodding silently. As we drove toward the border, the atmosphere in the car grew increasingly tense. That's when things started to unravel. Instead of taking the main road toward the temple, the car turned onto a dirt track that wound through dense jungle. When I mentioned this wasn't the way to the temple, Min's demeanor changed completely. Her warm smile vanished, replaced by a cold, business-like expression. "Your development skills will be very useful," she said, matter-of-factly, not meeting my eyes. "The compound needs people like you." The compound. Those words sent a chill through me. I had read about the notorious scam compounds in Myanmar, where Chinese criminal syndicates held thousands of people captive, forcing them to perpetrate online fraud schemes. The stories described brutal conditions, torture, and even organ harvesting for those who failed to meet quotas. The car accelerated, and I noticed we were heading toward a section of the border, known for its illegal crossing points. The 2 men in front spoke rapidly in a dialect I couldn't identify. Not Thai, not Burmese, but possibly Wu Chinese. Through the tinted windows, I could see the Thai landscape giving way to increasingly remote terrain. Min began explaining my future employment in a detached voice, as if discussing a regular job opportunity. I would be joining their technology department, she said, developing platforms for cryptocurrency investment schemes. The pay would be excellent if I cooperated. The underlying threat in her words was clear. My phone had lost signal long ago, and the child locks were engaged on the doors. The men in front were built like security personnel, and I had no doubt they were armed. Min had orchestrated everything perfectly. A month of building trust, gathering information, and waiting for the perfect moment. As we approached what appeared to be a makeshift checkpoint, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Another vehicle was ahead of us, a similar black SUV. Through its rear window, I could see someone who looked like another Westerner, their face pressed against the glass in panic. Then I heard Min's voice, now devoid of any warmth. "Welcome to your new life." Survival instinct kicked in as we approached the checkpoint. I noted every detail, knowing they might be crucial. 3 men at the makeshift barrier, all armed with what looked like Chinese-made pistols, wearing civilian clothes but with military boots. Behind them, a dirt path led into Myanmar territory, where I could see more vehicles parked among the trees. The reality of my situation crystallized. Over the past year, numerous reports had emerged about these operations. Compounds in Myanmar's lawless border regions, run by Chinese triads, where captives were forced to run elaborate scams. The victims were often well-educated professionals, their skills valuable for crafting convincing fraud schemes. Min's phone rang. As she answered it, I caught fragments of conversation in Mandarin. My basic understanding of the language picked up mentions of delivery and technical talent. She was discussing me as if I were cargo. That's when fortune intervened. The SUV ahead of us had stopped, its occupants arguing with the checkpoint guards. The delay created a moment of distraction. Through the window, I noticed something else. A Thai border patrol vehicle partially hidden in the foliage about 50 meters away. They were monitoring the illegal crossing point. What happened next was pure desperation. I knew that if I crossed that border, I would disappear into Myanmar's maze of scam compounds. The stories of escape attempts were horrific. Beatings, electrocution, and worse. Many victims were sold multiple times between compounds, each transfer taking them further from any hope of rescue. I made my move when one of the men in front stepped out to check the delay. The door's child lock meant my only exit was through the window. I smashed the emergency hammer against the glass, a move that surprised even me. The shattering sound drew immediate attention, but it also did something else. It alerted the hidden border patrol. Chaos erupted. The border guards raised their weapons, but the sudden appearance of Thai border patrol vehicles created confusion. Min screamed something in Mandarin, and the driver attempted to reverse. In the mayhem, I dove through the broken window, hitting the ground hard, but managing to roll into the dense undergrowth. The sound of gunfire erupted behind me as I ran. Not aimed at me. The border guards were engaging with the Thai patrol, creating a firefight that worked to my advantage. I could hear Min shouting orders, but her voice was drowned out by engines starting and tires spinning in the dirt. I ran without direction, pushing through thick vegetation, branches whipping at my face. The only clear thought in my mind was to put distance between myself and the border. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, I found myself on what appeared to be a logging track. The sounds of the confrontation had faded, replaced by the normal sounds of the jungle. My phone was still in the SUV, along with my wallet and passport. I was alone in the jungle near the Myanmar border, but I was free. Noticing the setting sun, I walked southeast, knowing Mae Sot lay in that direction. After several hours, a farmer on a motorcycle found me and, seeing my condition, took me to the nearest police station. The aftermath revealed the scale of the operation. Thai police had been monitoring that crossing point, suspecting it was part of a human trafficking network supplying victims to Myanmar's scam compounds. The compound I was destined for was identified as one run by the Broken Tooth Syndicate, known for its particularly brutal treatment of captives. Investigation revealed Min's real identity. She was part of a sophisticated recruitment network. Her job was to identify and groom potential victims, particularly those with technical skills. The dating app profile was carefully crafted to appeal to Western tech workers, and she had played her role perfectly. The most chilling discovery came later. In Min's seized phone, police found a folder containing surveillance photos of dozens of other targets in Mae Sot. Digital nomads, teachers, and technical professionals. Each file included detailed notes about their skills, routines, and potential value to the scam operations. I was just one of many marked for abduction. Today, that temple she mentioned, Samnak Song Phra That Doi Hin Kieu, stands as a reminder of how close I came to disappearing. The scam compounds still operate across the border, and occasionally, new stories emerge of people vanishing from Thai border towns. But now, when I hear about dating app matches in border regions suggesting temple visits, I make sure to spread the warning. Not all cultural experiences are what they seem. Story 13, 3 hours in Bang Lang. When I accepted the teaching position in Songkhla, I was drawn by southern Thailand's reputation for pristine nature and authentic cultural experiences away from the tourist crowds. The warnings about the Deep South's insurgency seemed distant and abstract, something that happened in other places to other people. As an avid hiker who had explored national parks across Southeast Asia, Bang Lang National Park appeared to be an ideal weekend destination. The park's reputation for spectacular waterfalls and rare wildlife overshadowed any security concerns. My cursory research showed that insurgent activity had declined significantly since its peak in the mid-2000s, and recent years had seen relative calm. I set out early one Saturday morning in my rental car, enjoying the drive through Songkhla's countryside as it gave way to the mountains of Yala province. The park entrance was quiet, unsurprisingly, given the early hour and its location in what foreign embassies designated as a red zone. The ranger station appeared unmanned, which should have been my first warning. The initial hours of my hike were peaceful. The trail wound through dense rainforest, occasionally offering glimpses of the Malaysian border in the distance. The humidity was intense, but the canopy provided welcome shade. I encountered no other hikers, which at the time I attributed to the park's remote location. It was around noon when I first sensed something was wrong. The jungle's ambient sounds, birds, insects, monkeys, suddenly ceased. In the unnatural silence, I heard voices speaking in what I later identified as a local Malay dialect. Through the foliage, I caught glimpses of men moving with military precision, carrying what appeared to be assault rifles. My blood ran cold as I realized my situation. I had inadvertently wandered into an area known for insurgent activity, and now found myself potentially in the path of an armed patrol. The voices grew closer, and I could make out words that included Farang, foreigner. In that moment of terror, my training as a teacher, someone accustomed to maintaining composure in challenging situations, proved invaluable. I recalled reading about insurgent tactics in the Deep South. They often targeted symbols of Thai authority or Western influence. As a foreign teacher, I represented both. Moving as quietly as possible, I retreated from the trail, using the dense undergrowth as cover. The vegetation that had earlier been an annoyance now became my sanctuary. I remembered the basics of jungle survival from a course I'd taken years ago. Stay low, move slowly, and use natural features for concealment. The voices grew more animated, and I heard rapid movement on the trail I'd just left. They had found my tracks. The insurgents' familiarity with the terrain was evident in how quickly they moved through areas that had taken me considerable time to navigate. What followed was 3 hours of psychological torture. I could hear them methodically searching the area, communicating through hand signals and occasional whispered commands. Their search pattern was professional, suggesting military training. Later reports would confirm that many insurgents in the region had received training in foreign camps. I kept moving deeper into the jungle, away from any marked trails. The terrain became increasingly difficult: steep slopes, thorny vegetation, and the constant threat of venomous snakes. But these natural hazards seemed insignificant compared to the danger behind me. At one point, I found myself at the edge of a small cliff, perhaps 15 feet high. Below, I could see one of my pursuers scanning the area, his rifle at the ready. He was young, probably no older than 20, wearing civilian clothes but moving with military bearing. The moment he turned away felt eternal. My phone was useless, no signal this deep in the park. The sun's position became my only reliable reference point as I tried to work my way toward the main road. I knew that if night fell before I reached safety, my chances of survival would diminish dramatically. I heard the insurgents' frustration growing. Their voices became louder, less concerned with stealth. I caught fragments of conversation that suggested they had expected to find me quickly. A foreign teacher alone in their territory should have been an easy target. The breakthrough came when I heard distant vehicle traffic. The main road couldn't be far, but reaching it meant crossing more exposed terrain. As I waited for the right moment, I witnessed something that highlighted the gravity of my situation. Through a gap in the foliage, I saw 2 more men joining the search, carrying what looked like restraints and blindfolds. This wasn't just about intimidation. They had planned for abduction. Reports from the Deep South had documented similar incidents. Kidnappings followed by ransom demands or worse, politically motivated executions. The insurgency's tactics had evolved from direct confrontation to psychological warfare, using hostages to amplify their message. My opportunity came when a distant explosion, likely from the main road, drew their attention. The insurgents conferred briefly before several of them moved to investigate. Their departure created a gap in their search pattern, one that might not come again. I moved as quickly as I dared toward the sound of traffic, using every bit of cover available. The remaining distance felt endless, each step a potential giveaway. When I finally reached the road's edge, I stayed hidden, watching for any signs that I had been followed. A police truck appeared, routine patrol in a high-risk area. I emerged from the jungle and flagged it down, probably looking half mad from hours of hiding. The officer's initial suspicion turned to alarm when I explained what had happened. They quickly loaded me into their vehicle and radioed for backup. The aftermath was a blur of debriefings and warnings. Police reports confirmed increased insurgent activity in the area. They had been tracking a cell known for targeting Westerners. The ranger station's emptiness was explained. Staff had been withdrawn due to credible threats, but the park hadn't been officially closed. Today, I still teach in southern Thailand, but with a deeper understanding of its complexities. The insurgency continues its quiet evolution, less violent but more sophisticated. The incident taught me that security warnings, no matter how remote they seem, are written in blood and experience. Banglang's waterfalls, specifically the 9-tiered waterfall, remain unexplored on my list, a reminder that some adventures aren't worth the risk. When my students ask about that day, I tell them that paradise often has hidden dangers, and sometimes the wisest adventure is knowing when to turn back. Story 14, The Drone Hunt. The limestone cliffs of Khao Sok National Park rise like ancient sentinels from the jungle, their faces scarred by centuries of monsoon rains. In October, when the French tourist arrived at Khao Sok Holiday Resort, the park was experiencing its typical post-monsoon beauty. Verdant valleys shrouded in morning mist, waterfalls swollen with recent rains. He was an experienced traveler, according to the resort staff, with high-end camera equipment and a professional-grade drone. His passion for aerial photography had taken him to remote locations across Southeast Asia. Khao Sok, with its dramatic karst formations and pristine rainforest, represented the perfect backdrop for his work. The day began routinely enough. He declined the resort's offer of a guided tour, confident in his ability to navigate the park's trails. His drone, a sophisticated model with advanced tracking capabilities, would serve as both his creative tool and his guide. The morning light was perfect for capturing the limestone formations that make Khao Sok famous. What the resort staff tried to explain, what he may not have fully understood, was how quickly conditions can change in the park. The limestone cliffs create their own microclimate. where clear skies can transform into impenetrable fog within minutes. The wet season's rains had left the trails treacherous, the limestone surfaces as slick as polished glass. Late that afternoon, he approached a local villager with an urgent request. He would pay 2,000 baht for help locating his lost drone. The villager, understanding the dangers of the park after dark, declined. The tourist insisted he could find it himself. He was last seen heading toward Bantarat Mountain as the sun began to set. The mountain holds many secrets. Its caves and crevices have sheltered civilizations for thousands of years. Its cliffs, some rising hundreds of meters from the forest floor, are both beautiful and treacherous. In the darkness, with only a phone's flashlight for illumination, every step becomes a gamble. The search operation began the next morning when he failed to return. Resort staff alerted authorities, and teams from the Department of National Parks, Wildlife and Plant Conservation mobilized immediately. The initial search focused on the main trails around Bantarat Mountain, but yielded nothing except occasional footprints in the mud. Cell phone signals provided the first real lead. Technical teams traced his last phone location to a section of Bantarat known for its treacherous terrain. The area was particularly dangerous after the recent rains, with steep drops hidden by dense vegetation and slick limestone surfaces that offered no secure footing. The search teams included experienced climbers and rescue workers familiar with Khao Sok's challenging landscape. They worked methodically, using ropes to access the more precarious areas. The weather complicated their efforts. Frequent rain showers reduced visibility and made the limestone even more treacherous. On the fifth day, the abseiling team made the discovery. Near a particularly steep cliff face, partially hidden by vegetation, they found his body. The evidence suggested a fatal fall, likely occurring on that first night. His camera equipment was found nearby, damaged but intact. The drone, the object of his final search, was discovered wedged in a tree crown some distance away. The recovery operation was complex, requiring specialized equipment and experienced personnel to navigate the difficult terrain. As his body was carefully transported out of the forest, the park rangers noted how this tragedy exemplified a recurring pattern. Experienced travelers underestimating the park's dangers, particularly after dark. The subsequent investigation revealed more details about his final hours. His camera's memory card contained stunning aerial shots of the park taken earlier that day. The last images showed the sun setting behind the limestone cliffs. After that, there was only darkness. The French embassy was notified, setting in motion the somber process of repatriation. Meanwhile, local authorities began reviewing park safety protocols, particularly regarding solo hiking and drone usage. His death added to a sobering statistic: the hidden dangers of Thailand's natural beauty, claiming another life in the pursuit of the perfect shot. Story 15. The Dark Paradise. Koh Tao presents a disturbing paradox. From above, it appears as a jewel in the Gulf of Thailand, ringed by white sand beaches and crystal clear waters. The island has long been famous among divers and backpackers seeking tropical paradise. Yet beneath this picturesque surface lies a darker reality that has earned it the ominous nicknames Death Island and Murder Island. I began researching Koh Tao's history after a colleague disappeared there in 2019. What I uncovered was a pattern of suspicious deaths spanning decades, with common elements that suggest a single perpetrator operating with apparent impunity. The cases share disturbing similarities. Victims are typically Western tourists. Bodies are found in remote locations, and investigations consistently run into bureaucratic obstacles. The island's small size, barely 21 square kilometers, makes these unsolved cases particularly troubling. On such a limited landmass, with a permanent population of only a few thousand, the frequency of tourist deaths defies statistical probability. Yet attempts to connect these incidents are consistently discouraged by local authorities. The case that first brought international attention to Koh Tao's dark undercurrent occurred in 2014. 2 British tourists were found dead on Seri Beach, the island's main tourist area. The investigation that followed demonstrated the challenges of pursuing justice on Koh Tao. While 2 Burmese migrants were eventually convicted of the murders, serious questions remained about the integrity of the investigation. Evidence collection was compromised from the start. The crime scene was not properly secured, and crucial forensic work was delayed. More troublingly, reports emerged of torture being used to extract confessions from the accused. International observers noted numerous inconsistencies in the official narrative, but this case was merely the most visible example of a longer pattern. A British backpacker's body was discovered in a shallow water ditch under circumstances that contradicted the official ruling of suicide. The location and position of the body suggested staging rather than an accidental death. Speaking with locals revealed whispered stories of a powerful family's influence over the island. This family, whose name is never mentioned aloud, allegedly controls much of Koh Tao's tourism infrastructure. Their connections extend deep into local law enforcement and regional politics, creating what amounts to a small fiefdom, where conventional justice holds little sway. The pattern of deaths follows a disturbing timeline. Typically, bodies are discovered during the low season, when fewer tourists are present. The victims often share characteristics. Solo travelers, usually between 20 to 35 years old, frequently last seen in the vicinity of certain beaches or hiking trails. More troublingly, many victims had reportedly expressed concerns about being followed or watched in the days before their deaths. One particularly haunting case involved an American diving instructor who had worked on the island for several years. She had begun documenting suspicious activities around certain properties, making notes about unusual patterns of behavior she'd observed. Her body was found floating near a dive site, initially ruled as a diving accident. However, her equipment showed signs of tampering that an experienced diver would have noticed during standard safety checks. The investigation into her death followed what has become a familiar pattern on Koh Tao. Key evidence disappeared from police custody. Witnesses who initially came forward with information suddenly changed their stories or left the island. The case file eventually joined others in administrative limbo, neither closed nor actively investigated. Former police officers who have left the force have spoken anonymously about the frustration of investigating deaths on Koh Tao. They describe a system designed to obstruct rather than facilitate justice. Crime scenes are compromised before investigators arrive. Surveillance footage goes missing. Autopsy reports are delayed until decomposition makes certain determinations impossible. The island's geography itself seems to assist in concealing crimes. Dense jungle covers much of the interior, crisscrossed by remote trails that few tourists venture along. The coastline features numerous isolated coves and beaches, many accessible only by boat or through difficult terrain. Perfect locations for disposing of evidence or staging accidents. A former dive instructor who worked on the island for 5 years shared his observations about what he called the pattern. He noticed that certain areas of the island seemed to be unofficial no-go zones, places where even long-term residents knew not to venture after dark. These areas often coincided with locations where bodies were later discovered. Most disturbing are the similarities in how bodies are discovered. There's often evidence of calculated staging, positions that seem deliberately arranged, personal belongings placed in ways that suggest suicide or accident. Several victims were found with their phones and wallets intact, ruling out robbery as a motive. In multiple cases, victims' electronic devices showed evidence of being accessed after their estimated time of death. Local dive operators speak of areas where they won't take tourists, not because of dangerous conditions, but due to what one instructor cryptically referred to as bad energy. These restricted zones form a pattern when mapped, a series of locations forming a rough perimeter around certain properties owned by the influential family. The serial killer theory gains credibility when examining the forensic inconsistencies across cases. Several victims showed similar defensive wounds, suggesting a consistent method of attack. The positioning of bodies often indicates knowledge of police procedures, staged in ways that would initially suggest accident or suicide to untrained observers. What makes these cases particularly chilling is the evident sophistication of the perpetrator. The crimes show planning and familiarity with law enforcement procedures. The killer appears to understand how to manipulate crime scenes to suggest alternative causes of death, and seems to have intimate knowledge of the island's terrain and surveillance blind spots. Interviews with former residents reveal a culture of enforced silence. Those who speak too openly about the deaths often find themselves facing unofficial pressure to leave the island. Several who cooperated with international journalists later reported harassment, unexplained property damage, or sudden difficulties with their business licenses. The island's isolation plays a crucial role in maintaining this system of impunity. Koh Tao is accessed primarily by ferry, with service sometimes interrupted during rough weather. This limited access means that initial investigations are often conducted by local police before more qualified investigators can arrive from the mainland. By then, crucial evidence has often been compromised. The case files reveal another disturbing pattern. Many victims had some connection to diving, either as students or instructors. This suggests the killer may have knowledge of diving procedures and equipment, using this expertise to stage convincing accidents. Several victims were found with diving equipment that showed subtle signs of tampering, the kind that would only be apparent to someone with technical knowledge. The investigation into the prominent family reveals layers of influence extending far beyond the island. Their business interests span multiple industries: tourism, property development, transportation, creating a web of dependencies that makes challenging their authority difficult. Many locals depend on this family's enterprises for their livelihood, creating a culture of enforced loyalty. What emerges is a portrait of systematic cover-ups spanning decades. International investigators who have examined the cases note striking similarities in how local authorities handle these deaths. Initial crime scenes are quickly disturbed, often by individuals with no official law enforcement role. Key witnesses frequently become unavailable for follow-up interviews. Surveillance footage from crucial timeframes goes missing or proves to be corrupted. The family's influence appears to extend to mainland law enforcement and political circles. Attempts by foreign embassies to pursue independent investigations meet bureaucratic resistance. Requests for evidence or case files are delayed until they become moot. International forensic experts offered by victims' families are politely but firmly denied access. The geographical analysis of death locations reveals another troubling pattern. Many bodies are discovered in areas that should be regularly patrolled or monitored, yet initial response times are inexplicably long. In several cases, bodies were found by tourists rather than local authorities, despite being in relatively accessible locations. A former security guard who worked at one of the island's larger resorts shared his observations about unusual patterns of movement late at night. He described seeing vehicles traveling to remote areas during early morning hours, particularly following reports of missing tourists. When he reported these observations to his supervisors, he was quickly transferred to a different location. The diving community's involvement adds another layer of complexity. Several victims were experienced divers who had expressed interest in exploring certain restricted underwater areas. These zones, officially off-limits due to environmental protection, coincide with routes reportedly used for illegal activities. The killer's methodology suggests someone with intimate knowledge of both the island's terrain and law enforcement procedures. The bodies are often positioned in ways that initially suggest accident or suicide, but closer examination reveals subtle inconsistencies. The perpetrator appears to understand how different agencies respond to various types of death, manipulating scenes to trigger specific procedural responses that aid in concealment. The digital trail of victims provides additional insights. Analysis of their social media activities in the days before their deaths often shows a shift in behavior. Many had begun asking questions about certain areas of the island or expressing interest in its history. Several had made contact with long-term residents who could share information about the island's past. Some victims had unwittingly crossed invisible boundaries. They had photographed or attempted to explore areas considered off-limits by local authorities. In multiple cases, victims had been seen taking photographs of specific properties or watercraft. Their cameras or phones were later found with these images deleted, though some were recoverable through forensic analysis. The island's infrastructure itself seems designed to facilitate concealment. The road network features numerous dead ends and unmarked paths. Security camera coverage is notably sparse in certain areas, creating blind spots that coincide with routes between known crime scenes. Power outages frequently affect specific areas during crucial timeframes. Environmental factors compound the challenges of investigation. The tropical climate accelerates decomposition, making time of death determinations difficult. Ocean currents can transport evidence miles from crime scenes. The dense jungle quickly obscures signs of activity, making crime scene reconstruction nearly impossible after even short delays. The response of local authorities follows a predictable pattern. Initial reports emphasize the possibility of accident or suicide, often before full investigations are possible. Press releases focus on the victim's personal history, suggesting various non-criminal explanations. International media inquiries are met with increasingly restrictive access to information. A disturbing aspect of these cases is the apparent surveillance of potential victims before their deaths. Multiple survivors have reported feeling watched during their stays on the island. Some described unusual interactions with locals who seemed to be gathering information about their movements and plans. These accounts suggest a selection process, with victims possibly chosen based on specific criteria. Recent technology has begun to reveal new patterns. Tourist photographs shared on social media sometimes capture background details that contradict official timelines. GPS data from victims' devices occasionally shows movements inconsistent with accident scenarios. However, accessing this data often proves difficult, with devices frequently suffering water damage or other convenient malfunctions. As this evidence mounts, one fact becomes increasingly clear. Koh Tao's reputation as Death Island stems not from coincidence or statistical anomaly, but from a carefully orchestrated system of concealment and control. While the island's pristine beaches and vibrant coral reefs continue to attract visitors, Those considering a trip should understand they're entering a jurisdiction where normal rules of law enforcement and justice may not apply. The powerful family's influence extends beyond the island's shores, affecting everything from initial police responses to final case dispositions. For those who still choose to visit, essential precautions include never traveling alone, maintaining constant contact with family or friends off the island, sharing real-time location data with trusted contacts, and avoiding any interaction with the island's more remote areas, particularly after dark. Remember, on Koh Tao, a wrong turn, an innocent photograph, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time can have consequences that no travel insurance policy can mitigate. Perhaps most disturbing is the simplest explanation, that the family controlling Koh Tao faces an impossible choice between protecting their own child and upholding justice. If, as many suspect, the killer is a son of this influential family, then each murder represents not just a failure of law enforcement, but a parent's tragic decision to protect their child at any cost. Their power over the island becomes not just about maintaining wealth or influence, but about preserving a devastating secret that, if revealed, would destroy both their family and the island's economy. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most monstrous acts are protected not by malice or greed, but by something as fundamental as a parent's love. Story 16, The Thing in Phuket. I still struggle to explain what happened that night in our Phuket hotel room. My friend and I were nearing the end of our 2-month backpacking trip through Asia, looking forward to returning home to the States. We'd chosen a modest Airbnb in Phuket for what we thought would be an unremarkable overnight stay. The evening began normally enough. After checking in, we followed our usual routine, organizing our backpacks, sharing stories from the day, and eventually drifting off to sleep in the shared bed we'd grown accustomed to throughout our travels. I was in deep sleep when I felt my friend's hand grip my arm with unusual force. The sudden pressure pulled me into consciousness, and I turned to find her face contorted with fear. Her eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, on her side of the bed. "Do you see it?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed toward the corner. When I followed her gaze, my mind struggled to process what I was witnessing. In the corner stood, or perhaps existed is a better word, something that defied comprehension. It was massive, a dark presence that seemed to simultaneously expand and collapse into itself, like a living paradox. The entity radiated a metallic red glow that intertwined with its blackness, creating an effect I've never seen before or since. This wasn't a shadow or trick of light. It had presence, mass, and seemed to affect the very air in the room. I could feel energy being drawn away, as if the space itself was being consumed. The phenomenon bore no resemblance to human form. It was utterly alien, operating according to physics I couldn't understand. Yeah, ... I managed to respond, my own hand shaking as I pointed toward it. It's growing. What happened next remains a blank in my memory. I remember the terror, the pointing, and then nothing until morning. It wasn't like falling asleep. It was more like being switched off. The next day, we barely discussed what had happened. We exchanged a brief, "That was strange, huh?" and continued our journey, as if acknowledging it fully might make it too real. It wasn't until years later that we finally compared our recollections of that night. The alignment of our memories was unnerving. We independently described the same impossible entity, the same sensations, and the same inexplicable blackout. Our shared experience validates what I saw, yet offers no explanation for what it might have been. I've spent years trying to rationalize that night, But no explanation suffices. It wasn't sleep paralysis. We both moved and spoke. It wasn't a shared hallucination. The details matched too perfectly. Whatever we encountered in that Phuket hotel room remains a mystery that challenges my understanding of reality. Story 17. A Christmas Eve encounter. During the height of COVID-19 in December 2020, I experienced a harrowing encounter that demonstrated how Pattaya's usually tourist-filled streets had transformed into something more primitive and dangerous. The incident occurred while walking back to my condominium in Jomtien, after attending a small Christmas party at one of the few bars still operating. At approximately 2:30 a.m., I decided to take the route along the back streets, or, as Thais say, sois, rather than the main beach road, a decision I would soon regret. The streets were unnaturally quiet. The pandemic had stripped away the usual ambient noise of tourists, motorcycles, and street vendors. Only the distant sound of waves and the occasional rustle of palm fronds broke the silence. The first indication of danger came as I turned onto, as Thais say, Soi 7, a typically well-travelled street that now lay completely deserted. In the distance, I noticed several dark shapes moving with purpose. A pack of street dogs that had grown increasingly territorial during the tourist downturn. Without the usual food sources from restaurants and street vendors, these animals had become more aggressive. As I continued walking, trying to maintain a steady pace, the pack began to take notice. What started as 6 dogs soon became 8, then 10, emerging from shadows and side alleys. Their behavior displayed classic pack dynamics, several larger dogs in front, spreading out to flank my position, while others moved to cut off potential escape routes. The lead dog, a muscular mixed breed with distinctive battle scars, began the initial challenge. Head lowered, hackles raised, emitting a low, continuous growl that others in the pack soon echoed. This wasn't the typical territorial display I'd encountered before. These dogs showed the coordinated behavior of experienced hunters. My training in dog behavior from previous experiences in Thailand prompted me to maintain eye contact with the alpha while slowly backing away. However, the pack had already executed a perfect encirclement maneuver, using the narrow street to their advantage. Every step backward brought me closer to dogs positioned behind me. What followed was a tense standoff that seemed to last an eternity, but probably spanned only minutes. The dogs continued to close their circle, their aggression escalating from growls to sharp staccato barks, the kind that typically precede an attack. My survival instinct kicked in as I noticed a crucial detail. A half-constructed building about 30 meters ahead. If I could reach it, the confined space might neutralize the pack's numerical advantage. The challenge was getting there without triggering their chase response. I began moving sideways, keeping my eyes on the alpha while reaching for my phone. The screen's sudden light caused momentary confusion among the pack, buying me precious seconds. That's when I remembered what a local had once told me. These dogs feared loud, sharp noises because of their associations with angry shop owners. Using my phone speaker at maximum volume, I played a car alarm sound that echoed through the empty street. The sudden noise startled the pack, creating a brief moment of chaos. Several younger dogs retreated a few steps, but the alpha held its ground, baring teeth that gleamed under the sparse street lighting. The standoff escalated when one of the dogs attempted to circle behind me, moving close enough that I could hear its breathing. The pack was coordinating, some maintaining their threatening display, while others maneuvered for attack positions. They had likely used similar tactics on the local stray cat population during the lockdown months. My chances of outrunning them were non-existent. The only option was to maintain my slow retreat toward the building while keeping the alpha in view. Each step had to be measured. Too fast would trigger their chase instinct. Too slow would embolden them to attack. The situation reached its crisis point about 10 meters from the building. One of the younger dogs lunged forward, testing my defenses. I responded with a sharp shout and an aggressive step in its direction. A risky move that could have triggered the entire pack, but instead caused momentary hesitation. That brief pause was enough. I managed to back into the building's entrance, using a fallen piece of scaffolding to create a barrier. The confined space forced the pack to approach in a line rather than a circle, significantly reducing their tactical advantage. For nearly 20 minutes, I remained in that makeshift fortress while the pack maintained their siege. Eventually, the distant sound of a motorcycle scattered them into the shadows, though their growls echoed through the street for several minutes afterward. That night taught me how quickly familiar places can become dangerous when circumstances change. The pandemic hadn't just emptied Jomtien streets of tourists. It had altered the fundamental dynamics of the area, allowing nature to reclaim spaces we had taken for granted as safe. Story 18. A paranormal visitor in Bangkok. This story takes place one summer in Bangkok, Thailand, about 3 weeks after I arrived as a participant in an international exchange program. It is ultimately about respect for other cultures and some lessons you only learn the hard way. My name is Anna, and along with 19 others from all over Southeast Asia, I was enrolled in a university right beside the Chao Phraya River. But it was the week of the Buddhist New Year, or Songkran, so no classes were being held. Most of the students living in our dormitory on Boroma Ratchachonani Road, Taling Chan district, had gone back to their respective provinces for the holidays. At 20 minutes past midnight, when my Indonesian roommate Widya had already fallen asleep, I heard frantic knocking on our door. I was already lying down on my bed, and it was relatively late, so I was mildly annoyed. I thought it was one of the other girls on the floor. Perhaps they had run out of toothpaste. There were about a dozen loud and heavy knocks that should have woken everyone on that floor because the walls were so thin. Beside our door was a frosted glass panel, and I saw a silhouette. Someone was crouching there. It did not register to me as odd at the time. I approached, placed my right hand on the locked doorknob, and asked, "Who is it?" A woman started speaking in rapid, excited Thai. But the strange thing was that the sound was not coming from behind the door. It was coming from behind me, above me, from my left and right, from everywhere at once. After about 3 sentences, she stopped, and the silhouette vanished. It was the kind of dormitory corridor where all footsteps echoed, but this time, I did not hear anyone walking away. I was rooted to the spot, afraid to turn around, but afraid of lingering near the door as well. Somehow, I knew that what spoke to me was not human, or was no longer human, and I always assumed that if this ever happened, I would fall to the floor in a dead faint. But I didn't. I turned around and went back to bed. I didn't speak Thai. I wasn't sure if that made the situation better or worse. I thought of waking Widya up, but I was also afraid of looking silly. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to fall asleep. I woke up before Widya did the next morning, which was a miracle because she usually woke up first for her morning prayers. She was surprised to see me sitting up, and my facial expression must have told her that something wasn't quite right. I told her what happened. After giving me a very nervous look, she assumed her position on her mat facing the west and started praying. I woke up the other girls on the floor, gathered them in the corridor, and told them the same story. I remember that the other girls from the Philippines were spooked, as was Bufa, the only girl from Cambodia. The Vietnamese were a little calmer about it. The eldest girl, Dao from Laos, was visiting her sister who lived near Chulalongkorn, which was unfortunate because she seemed like the type who would have her wits about her at a time like this. She once told us that her home was haunted by spirits who shook her bed at night. The boys in the program didn't comment much, although one suggested placing a Buddha image in our room. Thavin from Laos taught me how to properly pay my respects to the Buddha image at the entrance of the dormitory with the full Buddhist bow, which I have since perfected. After dinner, Vidya went to our room to attend to her evening prayers and thesis, while I stayed in the lobby with the others. About an hour later, she appeared in a blaze of panic. "Anna! Anna! Anna!" She ran right into me, and I hugged her, asking, "What happened? What's going on?" She said that she had fallen asleep, but she woke up because someone was whispering in her ear in rapid Thai, and she saw a long lock of white hair across her chest. She said she couldn't move at first, but when the whispering stopped, she was able to get up and run downstairs. Predictably, we were very alarmed at this point. I was raised Catholic, but I wasn't practicing anymore. The others who had tried to rebuke the spirit, Thavin, who could understand Thai, started talking to the few Thai students who were also in the lobby. The strange thing was that none of them were surprised. They told me, in English, that if the woman had white hair and was visiting us, then she was the building's spirit guard, or Chow Ti. They said that they've all seen her before at one point or another. They also called my attention to strips of colourful cloth tied around a beam of wood at the opposite restaurant, and said that those were for the Cow Ti that lived on that piece of land. I've been seeing those strips of cloth all over Taling Chan, but I never bothered to ask what they were for. Things were starting to make sense, but I was still wondering why, of all the occupied rooms on that floor, she was frequenting ours. "Did you ask permission to stay?" a Thai student asked. "What? What permission?" I said. "Permission from Chow Ti. We always ask permission before staying." I felt ashamed for not knowing this, and I was so sorry for being disrespectful of the spirits. It turned out that for all the other rooms, at least one of them asked for permission to stay. It just so happened that they placed one Filipino and one Indonesian, who didn't know about the practice, in the same room. The others knew about it because they grew up in Buddhist societies where this is common. The Thai students assured us that she meant no harm. If anything, she was trying to welcome us. Vidya and I mustered all our courage, marched right back up to our room, and asked the Chow Ti to grant us permission to stay. We spoke in our native languages, hoping that the sentiments will somehow transcend the language barrier. The Chow Ti didn't appear to either of us or to any of the girls on that floor again for the rest of our stay. We remembered to thank her profusely when we left, and I've asked for permission to stay in every room I've slept in ever since. Story 19, Country Road. I live in Thailand, but not as an English teacher, NGO worker, or professional expat of any kind. I'm a local Thai, so if you're expecting some ladyboy joke from the title, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But I feel like I should let you foreigners know about what I've encountered last weekend. I know you foreigners don't normally believe in the supernatural, but I believe this subreddit is different. People come here to listen to extraordinary accounts because it is true, right? So please listen to my story. This knowledge might save your life when you next visit Thailand. I lurk on Reddit because it entertains me to read about other parts of the world. I'm just an office worker living in the capital city of Bangkok, wearing a tie, working on Excel, always being scolded by my American boss. But my home is in the rural countryside, lots of green paddy fields and sugar palms in the distance, with the backdrop of grey hills. It is the soothing sight of my childhood. I was raised there by my parents, who are rice farmers. I used to bring their buffaloes to graze in the fields, just so I could doze all day on its sturdy back. It is a place of my nostalgia. As an office worker, I try to visit my parents as often as I can, because they're old now, much too old for farm work. But still, they wouldn't lay their hands. Imagine if you're 60, but have to hunch over the field under a scorching sun, to plant the rice stalks all day from dawn till dusk. Anyway, I visit just so I can bring some joy to their hearts and hand them a little souvenir from the city. Usually, it's a little bit of money I can spare after paying for my rent, but when I'm running short, I would buy them some American sweets or cookies that I'm sure they've never tasted before. Sorry for the diversion, back on topic. So it is the past weekend that things become strange and terrifying. I could barely believe it if it hadn't happened to myself. If my uncle or auntie from the village told me that they'd seen what I'd seen, I would nod politely and secretly deride them for their superstition. But now that it happened to myself, I don't know what to believe. Last Saturday, I planned to visit my parents early in the morning, but my boss told me that he needs to have his PowerPoint done by 3 p.m. Just perfect. It would take me 5 hours to travel from Bangkok to my hometown by train, and the last one leaves at 2 p.m. So I went into the office and worked like I never did before. I skipped lunch and churned out the PowerPoint and immediately rushed to the train station. I barely made it in time to board the train. However, that means that I will have to walk to my parents' home when it is dark, and that makes me nervous. It is known that no one should walk around after dark in my village. Now, before you criticize me, I am not a superstitious man. I'm a city dweller, an office worker, a man of science. I'm more scared of physical threats like being mugged or murdered, even if it's unlikely to happen in the lonely, quiet track to my parents' house. The nervousness comes from my upbringing. In my village, and many others in Thailand, we believe in folk tales and ghosts. Instead of a doctor, my parents would bring me to a shaman whenever I'm ill. When I was suffering from dengue fever at the 13th year of my life, the old crone of a shaman had crouched over me with her teeth stained black from betel nuts, breathing over me with a sickly sweet stench. She then declared that I was plagued by a malevolent ghost who would soon kill me if it wasn't appeased. My parents immediately cooked up a feast and brought the offerings to pray before the local banyan tree, lighting candles and asking monks to perform a prayer service. They said that cured me and was the reason I'm alive today. Of course, I don't believe them now. I know that dengue fever is caused by a virus transmitted by a mosquito, but still, once you are raised in that kind of belief, it is hard to shake it off. All throughout the slow, trudging train journey, then the bus journey on the winding road through the darkening countryside, I couldn't find a comfortable seat. I kept fidgeting, shifting around, checking my phones over and over. I told my parents that I would arrive late, and they told me that it might be better if I moved my visit to the next weekend. I then told them that I'm already on the train, and they told me that it's better if I spend the night at the train station. I grunted and didn't reply. I was determined to make the journey that very night. I wanted to surprise them. I wanted to prove the village wrong. I was determined to visit them and prove that village belief was outdated, to make a difference with my superior beliefs from the city. Looking back, I realize now that I was just using those excuses to calm my fears. Because when I got off the bus around 8 p.m. and saw the track leading through the paddy fields toward my parents' house in the darkness, all my reasons became flimsy and fragile. We had street lights only on the main road, but nothing on minor trails. I felt a childhood fear tugging at my heart. Why didn't I listen to my parents? I thought. Without thinking, I picked up my phone to call them again, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. Usually, I would get 3G internet even when I'm out here. I blame the signal failure. We get plenty of those. Cicadas were chirping, and insects began to gather around me, so I couldn't just stand out here to be a sitting blood bank. So gripping the talisman around my neck, I went off the dark trail that I would normally be so familiar of, that would remind me of home. It didn't feel that way now. That was when I realized that I've never wandered out here before in my life. The 1 kilometer walk to the house never seemed so long before, and I felt like a little boy once more. The trail was between 2 paddy fields, each locked in a low level of water to help rice grow, and the first 100 meters was easy enough because the street lamp still illuminated the way. But beyond that, I had to use the torchlight from my phone to light the path in front of me, just in case there were snakes or scorpions. A whistling wind blew across the farm, and I shivered at the sound. I crept along through the narrow trail until I saw the shadow of 3 sugar palms on my right, near the halfway point. I sighed and made a little smile, beginning to feel foolish for being so afraid. Just as I was easing my grip on my talisman, the world was plunged into darkness. The street lamps were all extinguished. Power cuts were common in rural Thailand, but my heart froze, holding my breath in my chest. There was only my phone torch left in front of me, and the moon and stars that offered too little light for my city dwellers' eyes. I looked around wildly, throwing my torchlight everywhere, and an old prayer chant came naturally to my lips. Then I remembered that there should only be 2 sugar palms instead of 3. I shone my light there and found 2 trees. I heard a plop, a dipping sound in the paddy field behind me, and spun around. I saw 2 long stalks of legs. I looked up to a pale, naked, emaciated body and arms as thin as chopsticks. I couldn't scream. My prayer stiffened on my lips, and I fell into the muddy paddy field. I dropped my phone. It leaned down, long spidery legs folding, and the face came into the beam of my phone torchlight. Its eyes were pale like the blind, wispy hair, and its horrible, horrible mouth had shrunken into a tiny round hole, smaller than my finger. It wheezed air through the hole in a shrill whistle and seemed to speak. When I couldn't reply, huddled in trembling silence, it whistled again, more shrilly, a tortured tone, and brought up 2 white hands, as big as palm fronds, to make a wide gesture, putting hands together in prayer that we Thai people are famous for. The sign meant greeting, thanking, or begging. I knew what it wanted. An old folklore was drilled deeper into me than the constructs of modern-day society, but I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even control my bladder or utter a prayer. Its expression changed, and the pale eyes grew bloodshot, and the whistling suddenly stopped. Out of the hole of its mouth, a long red tongue rolled out and never seemed to end, until it was as long as my arm, then even longer. Bile rose to my throat and I wanted to vomit, but that physical bodily reaction woke me up from my paralysis, and I finally screamed. I nodded furiously. I put my hands together to weigh it return, and words came blurting out of my soul. I promised it a feast. I told it that it would never starve again. I swore that monks would bless its soul so it would suffer no longer. The tongue stopped extending and finally retracted. Its hollow eyes met me for a moment and finally stood up on those spindly legs and swayed off into the blackness, the plopping fading, and was gone. I stayed where I was, soaked among the rice stalks. I didn't know how long I stayed there, but when the street lamps finally came back, I scrambled back to my feet, grabbed my phone, and sprinted to my parents' home. According to myth, what I have seen was a lost soul. It would roam the spirit lands, forever hungry, because its mouth was too small to eat anything. So on Sunday, I immediately went to the temple to pray to alleviate its suffering, and bought noodles as offerings placed before the 2 sugar palm trees near my parents' home. The noodles should fit in its tiny mouth. I'm back in Bangkok now, and I begin to wonder what would have happened if I didn't know of the ghost or couldn't remember the village's teachings. It would have killed me, there's no doubt, to drain my blood, open my guts, and suck my intestines. So here's my warning to you, traveling foreigners coming to Thailand. I know you like to travel to rural parts of Thailand for an exotic cultural experience, but please remember that these are obscure areas, cut off from the wider world. Whenever you happen to meet a ghost, pray for it and give it offerings. Be more open-minded and don't wear your rationality as a token of pride. There are many things that you don't understand in this world, beyond the scope of cold, hard science. Don't be arrogant. Listen to villagers and respect their ways, because superstition might save your life like it has saved mine. Story 20. The dangers of the woods. Thailand is a beautiful country and a wonderful place for a vacation. But if you ever stay in a location near the woods, don't go out at night. Me and a couple of my buddies, Tom and Lucas, had just finished college and were looking for a nice relaxing vacation. I convinced them to come with me to Thailand. I'd been there a couple of times before, and it was far too beautiful and relaxing. We decided to check out the Chiang Mai region in the north, since I'd never been up there. We stayed at a small village that held a motel for tourists. It was a bit of a shack, but it had air conditioning, so I didn't complain. The room had 2 beds and a couch, and Tom was the one who got to sleep in the latter. There was no way any of us wanted to share beds with another dude. We wanted to explore the forest when we arrived, but it was already late in the day and we were exhausted from the long trip. We decided to chill out for a while and explore the village. The woman who owned the motel was the only person there who spoke English, albeit poorly, and was nice enough to show us around and babysit us ignorant Americans. She spoke to us before settling in for the night. The only thing you guys need to know is important rule we have. Never go out at night. Why not? Asked Lucas. Because forests have dangerous animal. You no one gets snake bite or spider bite or nothing, she replied. We didn't think anything of it as we prepared for bed. But right before we settled in, Tom noticed something as he looked out the window. You guys, come look at this, he said. The village was seated on top of a hill, which allowed us to get a spectacular view of miles of forest beneath an ocean of stars from our window. But there was one thing in particular that caught our eye. There appeared to be a strange light coming from several miles away in the moonlit forest. It was a white light, which appeared to be pulsating as it moved through trees and brush. What do you think it is? Asked Tom. I haven't got a clue, replied Lucas as I shrugged my shoulders. I'm guessing it's just some dude with a lantern, I said. I thought it was against the rules to go out at night, said Lucas. Maybe he isn't from the village. I responded, or maybe he just don't care about the rules, said Tom. We stared at it a few minutes before shrugging it off and going to bed. The next day we awoke with the sunrise, had breakfast, and headed out towards the forest. Next to the path leading out of the village, there was a pit with a waist-high bamboo fence surrounding it. We held our breath as we walked by, unable to stand the horrid stench it emitted. Inside was filled with what appeared to be animal entrails, rotting rice, dead lizards, and maggots. Bleh! Why'd they have to put their waste pit right next to the path? I complained. We spent hours exploring the forest, examined the wildlife that could be found. We found snakes, wildcats, a troop of monkeys and lizards, including a monitor lizard. The forests of Thailand were so rich with life compared to those in the northwestern US. We would return to the motel each night, and each night we would see the light coming from the forest, always in a different spot, always pulsating and always moving. Eventually, I asked the motel owner about the light. "Oh, I don't know," she responded. "People here see the light too. They think it a ghost." "A ghost?" I asked. "Oh, it's just superstition," she replied. Indeed, Thais were very superstitious people compared to Westerners, especially in the rural regions. I believe in the supernatural, but as a science major, I always raise an eyebrow of skepticism to claims like this. Nonetheless, it triggered my curiosity. One day, we stumbled upon a dead leopard. It looked like a fresh kill and appeared to have had its organs devoured from the gaping hole in its abdomen. What could have killed a leopard like this? I asked. The other two just continued to examine the creature with puzzled looks. "What if that light in the forest was actually a poacher?" asked Tom. "And why exactly would a poacher only take the entrails?" I replied. "It looks like an animal attack, but why would an animal only take the entrails?" said Lucas. We had no answers, nor did the motel owner. But my curiosity got the best of me. I wanted to know what was causing the light, and if it had anything to do with the leopard. I bugged my buddies to join me and sneak out during our last night at the village. They didn't want to at first, but after calling them chicken and pansies, I finally coerced their inner masculinity to join me. We armed ourselves with machetes sheathed on our belts, and we quietly snuck out a couple of hours after sunset. We brought flashlights with us, but only intended to use them when we absolutely needed to. The moonlight was sufficient for most areas, and we didn't want the entity to know we were approaching it. As we drew close, I noted two strange phenomena occurring around us. The first was that the nighttime forest, usually noisy with insects chirping and frogs croaking, has begun to dim down to near silence. The second was the sudden drop in temperature as we drew near. In Thailand, 75 Fahrenheit is considered cold weather, and anything below 70 was freezing. As we drew near, I could actually begin to see my breath. We were starting to shiver, having left the room with only t-shirts on. It was theoretically explainable by natural phenomena, but I began to suspect that something beyond science was at work here. I nonetheless continued on, expecting to find a natural cause for these observations. That expectation began to wither as we were now close enough to observe the light source more clearly. Not only was it pulsing, but it also appeared to have tendrils of light surrounding it. They moved like plasma through the air. The main source was obscured behind a bush, but it became quite clear that there was a figure standing within it. A Thai woman, young and beautiful. Only her face could be seen from over the bush. A 3-foot radius around her was the light originating from. It pulsed about once per second, dimming briefly before returning to normal. Her gaze was toward the ground. My heart pounded with excitement, astonishment and fear. What was she? A ghost? An angel? We stood there in silence and amazement until somebody broke a twig underfoot. The girl's eyes shot in our direction. She knew we were watching her. She stared for a moment before she darted behind the bush she was hiding behind, and her obscure figure began to drift away through the forest. I was more than curious now. I was hooked to a line. and could only be satisfied by understanding the thing I had seen. The other two had felt it also, and followed me without hesitation when I directed them. We had our flashlights on now, walking swiftly in pursuit of the entity. We watched as it entered into a cave on a cliff wall and stopped just outside of it. We knew from horror movies that dark forests were a bad thing, and caves in the middle of them were even worse. "Bro, I'm scared," said Tom. "I don't want to go in," said Lucas. "Well, do you expect me to go in alone?" I replied. "It's not too late to turn back. We can forget this ever happened," said Tom. No, we can't forget, and my ignorance will haunt me if I fail to understand what that thing was," I said. We paused for a moment, looking at one another, as if drawing straws in our minds. I finally volunteered. "I'll go in under the condition that you two owe me all I can drink for the rest of the year." They stood for a moment before Tom spoke. "Fine, I'll buy you drinks. If you want to go in, you can. We'll wait here." With much hesitation, I slowly walked into the cave, praying under my breath. I was now shaking, not from cold, but fear. The odor came quickly, the same as the one emitted from the pit of rotting entrails, but it was far stronger. I coughed as I covered my nose with my shirt. Before long, I noticed the bottom of the cave was littered with animal bones. I was just about to chicken out when I saw the back of her head protruding from behind a rock. I stood and stared for at least a minute, not knowing how to respond. Finally, I managed to whimper a hello to the entity. It turned around, and I saw its face once more. But this face was no longer that of an enchantingly beautiful Thai woman. It was hideously burned, charred black teeth partially exposed through deteriorated flesh. Her eyes had shriveled in their sockets. The creature slowly drifted into full view from behind the rock, each additional inch causing my heart to sink deeper into my chest. The creature's body wasn't a body at all. It didn't even have a neck. Instead, the creature's entrails dangled from its windpipe and hovered above the ground. Its heart was beating, the light pulsing along with it. Its stomach and intestines slowly squirmed, as if the creature was digesting something. Chunks of adipose were attached to its viscera, which dripped with a mixture of blood and fat. My jaw dangled as I stood there, frozen in terror at what I saw. Its lungs contracted as it let out an unnatural hissing shriek. It lunged towards me, and I finally turned around and sprinted as fast as I could out of the cave. "Run! Run!" I shouted towards Tom and Lucas, who were waiting for me. They saw the creature behind me as I ran past them, and without hesitation, they followed behind me. We ran and ran, occasionally stumbling over a log or brush, but always making sure that we were together and that nobody had been left behind. The creature certainly hadn't, and it was no more than 200 feet away at any time. Eventually, I spotted an animal with my flashlight, which began running across the forest floor with us. It looked like a feral pig. Hoping to make a distraction, I pulled out my machete, caught up to it, and struck it in the neck. It shrieked in pain and stumbled, but I kept on running. Before long, I began hearing the animal shrieking furiously behind us. I turned my head back to look and saw that the entity had captured it. I stopped in my tracks to catch my breath, my friends joining me. We watched as the animal was suspended in the air by the creature's tendrils of light, which were ripping out the animal's intestines. I felt sick and wanted to vomit as I saw it begin to devour the raw viscera. We continued to run onwards back to the village, clearly visible on the hill, with lamplight emitting from our room. Gasping for air, we burst into the room and locked the door behind us before collapsing to the floor in exhaustion. We closed the curtains, dimmed the lights, and sat in our beds, not daring to even try sleeping. The other two were silent as I prayed and clutched at the crucifix around my neck. "What was that thing?" whispered Lucas. "A demon, a ghost, a monster? I have no idea," I responded. We sat in the darkness for an hour or so, before we saw a pulsating light emerging from the forest. We quickly hid under the beds and held our breath. We could hear strange sounds from outside, as if the creature had been devouring something else. Within a few minutes, it stopped, and the light faded. We continued to hide until the break of dawn, and we stayed in our room until we saw other people coming out of their houses. "I told you, Guy, not to go out at night," the motel owner said with anger. "We should have listened," I replied. The other villagers also seemed aware of what we had done. They stared at us angrily as they began taking rotten food to the pit just outside of the forest, which was now empty. We left southbound to Pattaya, where I spent the next few days taking great liberty in my free drink privilege. We tried our best to sleep, but nightmares kept waking us. Any encounter with a rotten smell or a light in the darkness brought me dread. Eventually, I went to a temple and spoke to a monk about what I'd seen. He explained that in Thai mythology exists a creature known as the Krasu, or Grasu. As the legend goes, a beautiful woman who lived centuries ago was burned at the stake. A witch tried to save her by casting a spell, but did so too late. Only her head and inner organs survived the fire. Her spirit is said to haunt the forests of Thailand and is always hungry. She devours the entrails of animals along with rotting carcasses and rotting food. Thailand is a beautiful country and a wonderful place for a vacation. But if you ever stay in a location near the woods, don't go out at night. Story 21. The Hidden Southern Beach. I'd heard about the secret beach from some Thai fishermen and had my heart set on studying the unique ecosystem. But the rest of my group said the idea had dumb foreigners get themselves killed by acting like dumb foreigners written all over it. Then later on that night, at some dive bar, Johnny waited until our girlfriends nipped to the bathroom and told me he was in. He even promised he'd talk the ladies round, so long as I helped him with a special surprise. 3 months of traveling together had taught me that guy could get anything he wanted with a quick flash of that movie star grin. He waited until Alex and Vicky got drunk on fishbowl cocktails before saying, "I think it sounds like fun. While Gary's off creaming over fish, the rest of us will have the place to ourselves. We can rent a little boat and set off before sunrise. I'll leave a note telling the hotel staff to send help if we're not back by supper." "I'm in," Alex said, snuggling into Johnny's muscular arm. Vicky pursed her lips. She and Alex had been best friends since childhood and looked so alike, short, with blonde hair and bright smiles. Locals frequently mistook them for sisters. "Fine," she said. First thing in the morning we set off cutting through waves, Johnny at the helm. The sun stayed hot on our backs, and sickening fumes from the boat's engine mixed with the salty ocean air. Did you know Thailand has almost 3,000 miles of coastline? That's a lot of ocean for hungover tourists to get themselves lost in. But, again and again, our fearless skipper insisted he knew the way. Close to noon, long after we should have arrived, he called, "Land ho!" Then everybody's head whipped toward a dark speck along the cerulean horizon. A giant sea stack, at least 300 feet tall, rolled toward us. I let out a quiet groan. Secretly annoyed macho man found the place through sheer dumb luck. It took 15 minutes for him to steer us toward a tunnel along the southern side, where he killed the motor and let the boat bob up and down. "Finally," said Alex, as she grabbed flippers and snorkels from beneath the stern. While Johnny wrestled a strap around his heel, he leaned in close to me and whispered, "Got everything ready?" I tapped the waterproof bag hanging around my neck. He shot me a thumbs up before tipping backward, overboard. Everyone else climbed down the ladder, me last, into the blissfully warm water. Beside the mouth of the tunnel, Vicky floated in place, anxious. "What's the matter? Afraid of the dark?" Johnny called back. "More like afraid of barracudas." "There's no barracudas around here," I said, swimming alongside her. The ocean was so clear you could see for miles around. "Come to think of it, I don't see any fish." Johnny said, "Give it a rest, Aquaman," then flicked on his headlamp and vanished into the shadows. He pulled that alpha male stuff a lot. My hand laced with Vicky's. "Don't worry, if any barracudas try taking a bite out of you, I'll use myself as bait." Guided only by our headlamps, the four of us swam along, the narrow trail widening further into the bowels of the stack. "These walls are freaky," Alex said at one point. "I think there's bugs crawling over them." After navigating a series of bends, blinding sunlight appeared before us. The tunnel opened onto a wide body of water, half the width of an Olympic swimming pool and probably 50 foot deep. A horseshoe-shaped beach encroached on three sides, outlined by a narrow forest lush with vegetation and palm trees. Everywhere you looked, there were vibrant hues of gold, turquoise and emerald, all silhouetted against the grey-black rock walls encasing the enclosure, giving the space this secluded, intimate feel. "Was I right or was I right?" Johnny yelled as he swam past the bowl and up onto the sand. "Paradise." You couldn't argue there. Hell, it's why I suggested the trip in the first place. After kicking off his flippers, he helped Vicky up onto dry land. I felt a pang of jealousy watching them smile at one another. The three of us spread out and explored while Alex floated aimlessly. The trees provided shade from the constant heat, while gentle waves crashed against rocks, producing a soft melody that could lull babies to sleep. There was no wildlife, not even a marine gastropod, which seemed odd. However, the uniquely shaped flora intrigued me. After a while, I noticed Johnny waving for my attention at the far edge of the beach. Oh, I'd almost forgotten. I grabbed the phone from my neck bag, opened the camera app, and gave him a nod. He reached into his shorts pocket, spun around, and discovered a lifeless basin. "Alex," he called out. Vicky stepped out from behind a fern. Johnny ran up to her and said, "Is Alex with you?" She looked from him to me and shook her head. I slipped my phone back into the pouch, then all three of us spread about, searching and calling for Alex. In under a minute, we completed a full lap of the forest. "Maybe she went back to the boat," Vicky offered. "She wouldn't go without telling us," Johnny replied, his voice wrought with concern. Just then, a gurgle went up, the sound of a clogged toilet with fish bones lodged in its throat. Altogether, we spun toward the water, and as we did, a wave crashed over the beach, nudging our discarded flippers. There were more gurgles, real guttural. Then a ripple spread out in every direction from the center of the bowl. It looked like a 500-pound cannonball had plummeted from the top of the stack. The resulting wave briefly engulfed our ankles and dragged the flippers away. Johnny shouted, "Alex!" His voice echoed off the enclosure, back at us. Vicky grabbed my arm, her pulse gathering speed. That horrible cycle continued. Gargle, wave, gargle, wave. This was no rhythm of nature, more like a beach gagging. "Gary, what's going on?" Vicky asked. Even though I specialized in marine biology, the group looked to me for answers about any kind of natural phenomena, then chastised me if I didn't know the answer. The next wave vomited strange, blue-white sausages onto the sand. I thought they might have been a trail of seaweed until I nudged one with my toe and felt something rubbery. "Oh," I said, flinching away. It was a rope of intestines threaded with veins. At the realization, a hush fell over the group. My eyes traveled toward the center of the basin, where a red mist spread through the clear turquoise, diluting like squid ink. Blood. Vicky retreated, stammering, while Johnny looked between me and the discarded intestine for nearly 20 seconds. What the freak is going on? The speed of those waves accelerated, cascading one after the other, and quickly dragged the pale snake away. A study flashed through my mind, one about dolphins launching themselves onto mud banks to create bow waves which maroon fish. This spark of a suspicion spurred me to say, "Get onto the rocks, there's something in the water." The two of them exchanged a look, another pang of jealousy stabbing me in the ribs. "Now," I shouted, louder than intended. The rocks were slippery with moss. While Vicky and I hopped past vines and the top halves of a palm tree in a deadly game of the floor is lava, Johnny stood with his head in his hands, internally debating while the water surged high enough to swallow his thighs. With reluctance, he eventually hopped after us. Meanwhile, those gruesome gurgles rang out, louder each time. Toward the back of the enclosure, boulders lay spread about, connected with the base of the rock wall. No sooner had we reached the edge, when the strongest wave yet broke against the chest-high rock, we'd all halted on and launched a hissing column of foam into the air. Now only a few meters of shrinking beach remained. The ocean had come to meet us. "We have to climb," I said, breathless. Johnny grabbed my shoulder before I could find a suitable starting point, spun me around, and pinned me against the wall. "What the freak is going on?" he shouted. "What the freak happened to Alex? Those waves are going to sweep us off this rock," I stammered. As if on cue, salty foam splashed over all three of us. "See, we're being hunted," I said, feeling ridiculous for even uttering the word. None of this was clear in my mind. "Gary, what the freak is going on?" a frantic Vicky asked from behind my assailant's shoulder. "Something hunted Alex," he said, like it was my fault, pinning me even tighter. "Yes, no, I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know? You're supposed to be the freaking brain box." "We have to climb," I said, my hysteria mounting. "There's something in the water." His right hand curled into a fist, but before the strike landed, Vicky grabbed his forearm and shook her head. She was trembling all over. Johnny released me begrudgingly. I felt around for divots and recesses, areas easy to traverse. My fingers were still wet, which meant I slipped again and again, and for a moment I had some sense of how spiders must feel trapped inside a bathtub. Roughly 8 feet up, I came across a portion of wall which had a cavity deep enough to lay flat along my stomach and reach down for Vicky. By now, the beach had been devoured. Only the caps of palm trees poked out, bowing under every wave. Following me up, Vicky's foot slipped once, twice. Come on, I shouted. Ever the hero Johnny, now gone up to his ankles, cupped his hands and boosted Vicky like a weightlifter performing a clean and jerk, raising her high enough she could be hoisted onto the shelf alongside me. He raced up the wall after her, his fingertips nudging mine briefly. I was stretching as far as I could, honest. But then the most powerful wave yet crashed into the wall. I lost sight of Johnny in the resulting spray. He resurfaced 20 feet ahead, already paddling in our direction. And at that exact moment, the repetitive gurgle transformed into a churn, like somebody yanked out a plug. Then the water swirled in rich, inward spirals. Immediately, the bowl became a whirlpool. My suspicions were correct. We were being hunted. But by what? What sort of creature manipulated the water like that? Within seconds, the beach emerged, reasserting itself. On the shelf, I pulled Vicky to her feet, and then we stood there, transfixed, while Johnny careened around a central point, closer to the middle of the basin area. His arms flailed as he screamed and got sucked toward the bottom of the vortex, 50 feet deep. And that's when I saw it, visible through the clear waves, but also a considerable distance away. What looked like a black serpent wrapped around Johnny's ankle, worming its way up his body. I grabbed the phone from my neck pouch and zoomed in. Huddled close to me, Vicky pointed at the screen and said, "What the freak is that?" It wasn't a serpent. For a moment, I thought it might be a giant tentacle. But then it split apart into 5 segments, which tapered off to the thickness of a severed arm, each dark on the outside, fleshy and pink on the inside, covered with rows of suckers, moving, twitching, writhing, like hundreds of hungry mouths. Wherever they eagerly latched on, skin tore off in fat clumps. Red mist spread about the water as our companion got reeled down like a fish on a line, the appendage flexing like a working esophagus. More and more water poured in through the tunnel we'd arrived by. As our friend plunged deeper and deeper, a gaping pit the diameter of a manhole cover shivered open directly beneath the tentacle. I zoomed in on that area, a horrible realization sliding up my spine. Luminous blue lights and barbed fangs lined the inside of the hole. It was a mouth. As the tentacle tongue reeled Johnny inside, the mouth closed with enough force to crush his ankles together, like the point at the end of a pencil. A trail of bubbles spewed from the poor guy's mouth, which meant he hadn't died yet, and even had some oxygen left in those lungs. Above him, the water level evened off, perfectly calm. Vicky buried her head in my chest, sobbing. The process of digestion took several minutes, and so far as I could tell, Johnny didn't die until he was disappeared up to his waist. Once he vanished, the stack quivered and shook. I felt the intense vibrations through the soles of my feet. Another gurgle went up. The beach whirled and foamed again. Then bones with gristles still attached floated to the surface. Leftovers. Vicky stopped sobbing long enough to say, "What the hell was that thing?" "A mouth," I said, emotionless. When Johnny got too close to the center, a tongue slid out, like a bobbit worm. On the verge of a complete breakdown, she said, "You mean there's some sort of killer worm down there?" The walls trembled with furious convulsions, like an expanding lung. I shook my head. "It's no worm. Please start making sense." By now, those circles of waves and ripples had gone up again, turning the pool beneath us into a minefield. Mercifully, there seemed to be a limit to how high the water could rise. We were safe. For now. "Look, the waters are violent again, see? And the walls, they're kind of shivery, right?" She nodded. "I think this whole stack is resting on something big. Think about it. The water level adjusted to capture Johnny. That suggests a level of intelligence. This sea stack, I think there's a creature beneath it. One big enough to make the entire structure shudder. So what? It hunts by gulping down water. Possibly. It's just a theory. Can you call for help?" She pointed at my phone. I tried. No. So what do we do? Dropping into the water would be like diving headfirst into a meat grinder, so that was out. I glanced up at the top of the structure. Professional climbers wouldn't risk an ascent that treacherous. A 250-foot journey to the top, with one small slip, meaning a plunge straight into the drink. Best case scenario, you'd crack your skull against an awkward rock and bleed out before getting slowly, painfully digested. Just then, the realization hit me. We could have escaped while the creature swallowed Johnny, I said. This thing's mouth closes to eat, which temporarily calmed the water. We missed our chance. Should we wait for the hotel staff to find us? They won't realize we're missing until dark. Then you have to factor in how long it takes them to find the boat, assuming they actually find it. Plus, we've got no food or water. I contemplated for a moment. You could tell from the way the bowl churned the creature understood more prey lurked close by. I think we should get closer to the tunnel, I said finally. It's the only way in or out. We can shuffle along this shelf. Look, it almost stretches the entire way. In the 20 minutes convincing her took, I found myself wishing I had half of Johnny's charm. Most of the journey was a careful sideward shuffle along an upward slope, our backs flat against the wall. But at one point, we had to spring over this little gap, and Vicky took her time working up the nerve. At the exact moment she leapt across, the stack trembled, which made her foot slip. My hand shot out around her waist and pulled her in close at the very last second. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. This creature knew where we were and what we were doing. It thought tactically. That unsettled me. Toward the edge of the shelf, 2 full bodies length away from the tunnel and 20 foot above the water, I looked straight down and said, "The creature can feel us." Vicky stared at me with sunburned eyes, confused. The walls trembled at the exact right moment. Maybe it detects movement along the stack, like a spiderweb. We stood until our legs ached, then sat, the sun bearing down hot on our chests. I made a mental note of everything I'd surmised about the creature. Our biggest threat was the fact it displayed a level of intelligence, or at least reacted to certain stimuli. And with Johnny, that reaction had been instant. No way we could swim through the tunnel before the creature responded. If it set traps by manipulating the reservoir and walls, then what did that make the beach? A cancerous growth, or perhaps a lure? Once again, my thoughts drifted back to that missed window of opportunity. At dusk, the darkened waves almost glittered. A briny aroma wafted out while we sat there, Vicky to my right, her head resting on my shoulder. My arms became overcooked slabs of beef, my mouth dry from the thirst. Neither of us would last much longer. Hell, in another few hours, swimming back to the boat would be harder than doggy paddling across the English Channel. Why did Johnny want to see this stupid place anyway? Vicky asked. He wanted to propose. She looked up at me, shocked. What? He was going to propose to Alex. He bought an engagement ring and asked me to take a video. He wanted it to be romantic and thought this would be the perfect spot. Idiot, she muttered. I sat there, contemplating my next statement carefully. What had I to lose? Not too much of an idiot to make out with though, huh? What? 2 weeks ago, I said, my eyes fixed on the shimmering waves. That nightclub in Bangkok. I nipped away to take a bathroom break, and when I came back, you and Johnny were... My voice trailed off there. The realization slowly spread across her face. Our lives are in danger, Gary. Is a stupid drunken mistake really so freaking important right now? A drunken mistake? You two were going at it like horny teens. At that moment, I felt more embarrassed than anything. I should have confronted them that night, or at least told Alex, but flights had already been booked, deposits paid. If I'd only had more balls, none of us would have wound up in this mess. Okay, Gary, it happened. She pushed away from me and stood. I did too. I had a lapse of judgment, and I'm sorry. Now that's out of the way. How the freak do we get off this stupid freaking beach that you were so obsessed with? A lapse of judgment? You think I haven't noticed the stolen glances? You always said Alex could have done better. Did you really mean Johnny? The two of us stared each other down, a showdown. Twitchy, paranoid. We both wished for the same thing, that the other would mercilessly slip off this freaking rock and into the drink. A dark part of me wanted to push her myself. Then, as if on cue, the wall jerked with such force my teeth chattered together. Had the creature sensed the tension between us? Or was it simply inconvenient timing? Either way, Vicky lost her footing and slowly slid along the shelf, her thin arms windmilling around, searching for something, anything to latch onto. She screamed as she toppled over the edge. A heroic dive forward by yours truly saved her at the very last second. I lay flat along my chest, our hands clasped, her trailing in midair, alternating between screaming and begging me not to let go. If I simply relaxed my grip, the creature would have rang the dinner bell. Was it really such a horrible idea? She, like Johnny and Alex, would already be minced meat if not for my quick thinking. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Despite everything, I still loved her dearly. However, before I could haul her up, the wall trembled again. The powerful vibrations did enough to force her hand and mine apart, sending her plummeting into the perilous waters below. I rose, heart racing, as she disappeared beneath the surface. By the time she re-emerged, the bowl was already alive with foam and spit and cascading waves. In the dim light, the inside of the mouth lit up like a glow stick, that tongue sliding out from the hole once again. As the water whirled toward the depths, Vicky got swept away. She slid toward the pit head first, trapped in the whirlpool. The tongue completely enveloped her skull. Within seconds, her top half had become flayed and unrecognizable from the sucker pads tearing away flesh in fat globs. Those skinny legs of hers did not stop kicking. A dark part of my mind pondered whether it would be better to go feet first, like my loving girlfriend, or head first, like her secret lover. I became so lost in thought I didn't notice the water level had already settled. By the time I was staring at nothing more than the soles of 2 bare feet, I had the realization it may already be too late. Amped up on fear and adrenaline, I took a little shuffle forward, became completely weightless for a moment, and then the water came up to meet me. I put everything I had into swimming toward safety. Gaining traction was a struggle. Every few strokes the current grabbed hold of me and held on tight. I swam through the darkness, relieved my hypothesis proved correct, but then, a powerful drag, like someone started slurping the ocean up through a straw. Main course over, time for dessert. I kept kicking. The walls slithered each time I touched them, a heartbeat. What did Alex say earlier? That they looked freaky. Oh freak, I hadn't escaped. I was still inside the creature. It didn't inhabit the stack. It was the stack. Perhaps I was swimming through an intestine, or the throat. Only vaguely aware of my destination, I kicked madly while, around me, walls shifted and shivered. No face, no eyes, but a simple sentence which made me tremble. A circle of moonlight drifted into view roughly 50 feet ahead. While I put everything I had into paddling, the water climbed higher and higher, hurling me from one wall into another. I became cut and bruised in a dozen places. Soon I could see the silhouette of the boat, but my rescue vessel drifted further and further away. No, not drifting. The creature was shrinking the tunnel, cutting off the exit. This Leviathan had a biology unlike anything else on Earth. As the cavern sealed itself shut, a huge wave of water careened toward me, one final obstacle. For a moment, I contemplated holding my breath until I lost consciousness and drowned, rather than be served up fresh. Pushing these thoughts away, I dove beneath the wave and launched myself forward like a torpedo. And once I reached a point where I couldn't hold my breath a second longer, I came up for air outside the stack. Behind me, the tunnel had puckered shut. Up ahead, the boat bobbed up and down, unconcerned by the day's events. Quickly, I swam around the side, hauled myself up the ladder, and flopped over onto the deck, exhausted. 4 of us set off that morning, and I hope now I've told you exactly what happened, you'll understand that I am in no way responsible for the others' deaths, and why their bodies will never be recovered.